The tale opens with a brief glimpse into Pharaohannis, a realm ruled by wizards. On the very night when the long war for the throne reached its final stage, a powerful noble settled on a plan that was both simple and merciless. The ninth prince Heinz had to die. One of the noble's subordinates waited eagerly for the order to be carried out, convinced that no ruler was worthy except the one he already served. Heinz had taken refuge in an unusual palace, and because of that, the command was cleared. Execute the prince and eliminate anyone who interfered. Yet before the group could move, one man chose action over words and struck down one of his own allies, sending him to an early grave. After that sudden act, the young man offers a polite apology and says that he wishes to speak with the second prince. The request alone is enough to make the others freeze in fear. A loyal guard steps forward, positioning himself defensively to block the intruder. When he notices the red eyes beneath the hood, he realizes that the enemy is an old acquaintance, a man he considers worthless because he possesses no magic. Certain of his victory, the guard grows overconfident. He is just about to claim that sneak attacks would never work on him when his body gives out and he collapses unconscious. With no path left to escape, the second prince is overwhelmed by despair. The strike had been flawless, shattering the nasal bone at a precise angle and damaging the brain, leaving the victim unable to cast spells afterward. Even after defeating that opponent, the boy senses another wizard still standing and ready to fight. A spell drawn from thunder spirits is about to be unleashed, but the caster is caught off guard when the boy kicks first, violently reshaping his jaw. The attacker even remarks that the wizard is free to leave if he wishes. Unable to chant spells, the warrior attempts a technique that requires no words. That decision ends badly, as a single blow sends him tumbling down the stairs. From where he stands, the second prince can only wonder how both a skilled swordsman and a Class A wizard were defeated so effortlessly. The boy calmly explains that there is no rule stating that only magic can cause harm. Panic sets in and the prince draws his weapon, asking whether Heinz sent him. Despite being an assassin, the young man states that this is not the case. He explains that he is there because of a friend, a claim that nearly drives the prince mad. The prince insists that it is impossible for a Gerudo to be friends with someone of royal blood. Desperate, he asks what price would buy his life. Hearing those words forces the intruder to relive painful memories, and he decides to end the matter quickly. Not long after, the death of the second prince is officially announced as the result of an illness, and the coffin remains sealed. With that, the dark presence looming over the palace finally begins to fade. Later, while quietly reading in his chambers, another noble is startled when the same figure appears before him and addresses him by name. Heinz, with his younger brother gone, there is no doubt that he will soon ascend the throne. The assassin asks how it feels to see his long-held dream becoming reality. Heinz replies that this moment is only the beginning. He reaffirms his promise that once he becomes king, he will abolish every discriminatory law imposed on those without magic. Having known him for so many years, the assassin does not question his sincerity, as their bond is genuine. Soon, however, the issue of a Garuda being barred from the coronation is raised. Heinz makes it clear that he will personally grant permission, which excites his companion. The assassin understands that he must avoid causing unrest and accepts that changing society will take time. With that in mind, Heinz suggests that his friend return to his hometown for a while. The assassin agrees, believing that rest is well deserved now that the war has ended. Later that day, he wrings out a cloth and cleans himself as thoroughly as he can. Carrying a lantern, he explores what appears to be an abandoned place, filled with arcane books and training dummies. It is difficult for him to accept that a life defined by constant combat may finally be over. Because he lacks magic, no one can sense his presence, a trait that has always been invaluable in his line of work. From the beginning, he knew his most dangerous enemies would be powerful wizards, along with swordsmen and martial artists. Realizing this, he once proposed learning magic himself if strength alone was not enough. Heinz had immediately reminded him that he lacked the gift, but the decision had already been made. He resolved to study magic harder than anyone else and train his body until he could overcome that weakness. That was the pact the two of them made before everything began. As he revisits the old study materials, the assassin reflects on how long and exhausting the war truly was. The next day, during a routine walk, a vendor calls out to him, inviting him to check the latest goods at the stall. Fresh pineapples are on display, a rare sight in that region. The boy considers buying one as a gift for a companion, confident it would make her happy. The merchant names the price as a single copper coin, but when he notices the red eyes beneath the hood, he immediately refuses to sell. In response, the assassin pulls out 2 silver coins and asks whether the man truly wants to do business. As expected, murmurs ripple through the crowd as people comment on a Garuda walking openly among them. As the boy continues forward, others step aside, afraid they too might be cursed. The so-called curse belongs to the only race without magic, the Garuda. Years earlier, a king decreed that the Garuda would be treated like livestock by the Alcair, establishing a hierarchy based entirely on magical ability. They were enslaved, used as expendable soldiers in wars, and subjected to massacres that were not only ignored but later encouraged. In time, Nearly every problem in the country was blamed on the Garuda, a convenient narrative for the monarchy. The thought makes the assassin feel sick. Even so, all he can do is hope for a future where everything changes completely. Along the road he notices a small girl trip as she struggles to keep up with her friends, falling into tears. Acting as any responsible adult would, he stops to help her. When she sees his red eyes, she hesitates for a moment. Her reaction, however, is not fear or disgust, but admiration. It is the first time anyone has looked at him that way. The child soon runs off, leaving the Garuda behind with an unfamiliar sense of hope. More than ever, the idea of being treated as an equal feels close at hand, and he knows this is only the beginning. Much later, as night settles in, the young man finds himself hesitating after 10 years away from home, wondering how he will be welcomed if anyone is still there to welcome him at all. Memories surface uninvited. Long ago, inside their small cabin, his mother had scolded him for playing with a knife instead of handing it over properly. Even when she told him he needed to find work, her tone had never felt demanding. It had always sounded like concern. She had wanted nothing more than for her son to find his place in the world and give his best effort. Aware that life would not be kind to him, she had reminded both him and his sister that they would always be welcome to return. Even now, 10 years later, he still carried an amulet tied to those moments, a quiet reminder of family and warmth. That sense of comfort shatters the moment he steps closer. Despite the late hour, the area is bright as day, lit by raging flames, and the heat is suffocating. In an instant, the hopeful future the assassin had imagined collapses. Faced with so much fire, his first thought is not fear, but a desperate question of whether anyone is still alive. For the first time in years, he speaks his name aloud, Van announcing his presence as if doing so might anchor reality. What answers him instead is horror. He finds a resident sprawled on the ground, body broken beyond recognition. Then another, and another. Some are not merely dead, but executed, their bodies hanging from a tree as a warning. Every face is familiar. The sight crushes his thoughts until they barely function. To Van, it makes no sense that criminals would go this far, but reason matters less than urgency. He needs to find his mother. He needs to find his sister, Rena. Everything he had done until now had been for them. His greatest dream had been to reshape the country into a place where they could live without fear. That dream dies the moment he reaches the spot where his home once stood. There, like the others, a body hangs lifelessly. As Van moves closer, his heart stops. He recognizes his mother. She is still alive, barely, and tries to speak, but the shock locks his body in place. His mind refuses to accept what his eyes are seeing. That denial shatters when he suddenly hears his sister's voice. Rena, gravely injured, is still breathing. She collapses moments after calling out to him. Van rushes to her side and supports her weight. Instead of explaining what happened, she pleads with him to run, insisting that the one responsible is still searching for him. Van struggles to believe that the second prince could have more allies and initially tries to help her instead. The blood pooling beneath them tells a different story. It has already spread too far. With fading strength, Rena confesses that she had learned how to cook during his absence. Through tears, she reveals that her greatest wish had been to watch Van eat something she made with her own hands. Slowly, the light leaves her eyes. With her final breath, she asks him not to blame himself, telling him that none of this was his fault. That moment is stolen from him when a knight drives a blade into his back. Several others cheer, convinced they have finally slain the leader of the rebel forces. Yet one of them notices that Van does not fall. His stance remains upright, and his eyes still burn with the will to fight. Before striking again, the knight asks why Van did not try to avoid the attack. Van answers that there is no one left alive whom he wishes to protect. To the knight, that response is worthy only of pity. Before accepting death, Van demands to know who ordered the massacre. The knight answers plainly that the command came from the king himself. Van cries out that Heinz would never do such a thing. As if summoned by those words, the blonde king appears before him, alive and uninjured. The sight leaves Van shaken. Everything about Heinz's demeanor suggests he had been waiting for the right moment to reveal himself. To make matters worse, Heinz mocks him, asking whether Van had come chasing memories. When he explains his reasoning, the king claims that Van himself is to blame. He declares that assassins capable of bypassing magical detection, hiding anywhere, and killing powerful figures with raw physical strength represent a threat to peace. Such beings, he insists, could destabilize his reign and therefore must be erased. Van reacts with revulsion at the realization that he has been deceived. Heinz calmly states that he will still keep his promise. Once the Garuda are exterminated, there will be no one left to suffer discrimination. As the knight prepares to deliver the final strike, Van catches the blade with one hand. Knowing the truth changes everything. Pain transforms into a burning need for vengeance. Even injured and exhausted, Heinz understands better than anyone what kind of monster Van can become. The knights quickly form a protective line around the king. Heinz himself prepares for battle. In the blink of an eye, Van breaches the first line of defense. Drawing on the secret shadow technique of his bloodline, he unleashes the attack known as Final Bloom. In response, Heinz gathers all his magic and releases Lucis Sagittarius. The clash between the two former friends shakes the battlefield. By the time the night deepens, the knights lie scattered across the ground. Even in that ruined state, Van continues to fight for his sister. Just as he refuses, even in death, to bow before the Alcaire, Heinz dismisses this as foolishness, yet admits that words would never sway him. Only force could bring the fight to an end. When it is over, Van clings to life, lost in thought. After enduring so much, he refuses to let his story end there. His revenge is unfinished. He needs one more chance, one opportunity to secure at least a tolerable fate for his own people. Whether by fate or fortune, his plea is answered. When his eyes close on the cold ground, they open again in a room so familiar it feels unreal. Reina comes up the stairs, asking whether her brother has finally woken up. Van shouts, asking if she is safe, but she reacts with confusion. Clearly unaware of anything being wrong, certain that this must be a dream, Van listens as she insists that he hurry and get dressed. It is his birthday, she reminds him. Their mother appears soon after, encouraging him to get out of bed. When Van looks into the mirror, disbelief washes over him. He has gone back 10 years. It is his 15th birthday. To celebrate, the family is preparing a picnic. His mother and sister comment that staying indoors on such a beautiful day would be a waste. Van begins to wonder whether everything he experienced was nothing more than a nightmare. That doubt falters when a gust of wind sweeps through the room, scattering flower petals. One brushes against his skin, and the sensation feels undeniably real. His body still carries the weight of countless battles. With that realization comes the scent of smoke from the city and echoes of Reina's final words. The pain of his pierced chest and the screams remain vivid. When Reina asks what is wrong, Van avoids the question and changes the subject. Soon after, their mother calls out, saying the picnic is almost ready. Van comments on the pleasant smell of the food, and Reina happily wishes him a happy birthday. At the same time, far away, a group of knights rides out in pursuit of heretics. There are few capable mages among them, and the number of soldiers is far from ideal, making failure a real possibility. Their destination is the autonomous district of the Garuda. One knight remarks that since the targets are not civilians, it does not matter if some of them die. Though uneasy, an Amazon warrior among them silently agrees. Back at the picnic, Van praises the meal, noting that the flavor carries a strange sense of nostalgia. The feeling unsettles him, especially since his mother had prepared something similar the day before with Reina's help. Because of that familiarity, he notices small imperfections in the dish. Gradually, he begins to accept that he has truly returned 10 years into the past. He has a chance to change everything, even if he does not yet know how. Once again, his mother asks whether something is troubling him, and Van remembers. Among the Garuda, turning 15 meant choosing a path in life. There were 3 options. The first was to work simple jobs within the city. The second was to leave in search of dangerous work. The third was to become a mercenary. Even without magic, the Garuda were physically strong, and their inability to be magically detected made them effective escorts. In times of war, they were sent to the front lines and rarely survived, but those who did were promised great wealth. His mother comments that mercenary work was not entirely bad, as such earnings had improved their lives. Still, she makes it clear that she does not want that future for Van. In the past, he had ignored her words and chosen that path, a decision that eventually led him to Heinz. That quiet moment is shattered by a loud sound. A bell rings. Van stands immediately, understanding its meaning at once. For a brief moment he had forgotten, but memory returns in a rush. He runs off, urging his family to leave the city without offering any explanation. Ahead, a man is delivering a speech, proclaiming that the gods have revealed dirt to be a sin. He declares that the kingdom still shelters impure beings known as the Garuda. According to him, they are born tainted and carry darkness within them. These speakers belong to the Purifiers, an extremist religious faction within the Mage Kingdom. Their radical beliefs have branded them heretics in the eyes of the Church. One of their doctrines claims that the Garuda are agents of evil. On Van's 15th birthday, these fanatics fled the capital and took refuge in the autonomous district. With no proper security in place, they began committing unspeakable atrocities in the name of what they called purification. That day Van had been forced to hide with his family in a narrow alley, powerless to change anything. This time he refuses to repeat that mistake. Already inside the city, he moves swiftly through the crowd, slipping between people, scaling walls, and staying out of sight. When the speech reaches its end, one of the purifiers steps forward, preparing to cleanse a Garuda's sins with fire. Van is already there. One of the first rules when facing mages is to strike from outside their perception. He targets the brain and the vocal cords, ensuring no spell can be cast. The moment he brings the fanatic down, however, his presence is exposed to both allies and enemies alike. Another zealot reacts in panic, but Van moves faster, seizing the enemy's own sword and driving it straight through him. Only weapons infused with magic can pierce mystical defenses, so using the opponent's blade is necessary. A different cultist begins chanting a long-range lightning spell, but Van hurls the fallen body into the path of the electricity, disrupting the attack entirely. From below, Van closes the distance and delivers a savage punch that sends his target flying. He believes only 3 enemies remain when one of them suddenly orders him to stop. The man is holding a woman hostage, threatening to kill her if Van does not comply. Van had not anticipated additional enemies, yet surrender offers no real advantage. The terror on the woman's face is unmistakable. Acting on instinct, Van drops to his knees and pleads for the man to stop. The cultist grins in satisfaction and shouts that Van should have behaved like this from the start. Moments later, another fanatic drives a heavy kick into Van's stomach, slamming him onto his back. The remaining purifiers, consumed by fury, begin beating him mercilessly. While they clearly want him to suffer, the one who appears to be their leader orders them to finish it quickly. A sense of dread grips him, as if leaving the boy alive any longer could lead to disaster. When he notices his companions hesitating, the leader releases the hostage so he can act himself. The instant the woman is no longer in danger, someone else intervenes, casting a spell of ice. The magic strikes the fanatic from behind, frost spreading rapidly over his body until he is completely immobilized. A knight warns him not to move, stating that even the slightest motion could shatter him. Invoking the kingdom's justice, she orders the arrest of all the fanatics, leaving the leader pale with fear. Van cannot help but wonder why, in his past life, reinforcements had arrived far too late. Even now, the cultist tries to command his followers to kill the hostage, but they remain frozen like statues. With that, the knights move in and disarm each of them, leaving Van face to face with the woman who saved him. She has witnessed everything Van did. Instead of reprimanding him, she openly credits him for the outcome. She reasons that the fire mage Van defeated alone could have reduced the entire city to ashes. While she admits she could have defeated him herself, she explains that she was devising a strategy to minimize collateral damage. Van's intervention, it seems, was what prompted the kingdom to act without delay. She then asks what reward he desires for his actions, but Van simply expresses his gratitude for her help. Curious, she asks his name, and upon hearing him identify himself as Van, she introduces herself as Helene. Even after Van refuses any reward, Helene invites him to visit the Magic Academy, a suggestion that leaves him completely stunned. Upon hearing the academy's name, Van asks whether it belongs to the kingdom. Helene confirms this and adds that even commoners may enroll if they show sufficient talent. Van recalls hearing of the academy in his past life, knowing that many legendary warriors and wizards emerged from its halls. Still uncertain, Van asks why she chose him in particular. In response, Helene suggests they speak somewhere else. She takes his hand and pulls him along with little regard for resistance, asking him to lead the way since he knows the area better. After several minutes and a river crossing, they arrive at a secluded location where no one can overhear them. There, Helene remarks that it would be the perfect place for an assassination. Without warning, she conjures a bow of ice and fires a freezing arrow at Van. Van reacts instantly, moving with speed comparable to a magical step, yet without using any magic at all. The feat shocks Helene. In a blink, he vanishes from her sight and reaches her blind spot. Even so, Van does not press the attack, as his instincts tell him she is merely testing him. Hearing such composure from someone so young unsettles her further. Van asks whether this was meant to be a test. Helene answers that it is simply her nature to confirm things with her own eyes. Van then asks what she intends to do with what she has learned. She replies directly that he may possess the power to change the fate of the Garuda, but that such a future can only begin if he enrolls in the Magic Academy. Van asks whether she is referring to the Night Conference. Helene confirms this, stating that she believes he has the potential to succeed. The Night Conference is a system that rewards outstanding academy students. Regardless of background or class, those who pass gain the right to establish a noble house within the kingdom. The land granted usually corresponds to the candidate's homeland. In Van's case, there would be no question that it would be the autonomous district of the Garuda. The idea leaves him stunned, as he has never considered such a possibility. Unlike his previous life, he is still under the age limit for the examination. Before agreeing, Van states that he has 3 questions. Helene agrees to hear them. First, he recalls that a noble recommendation is required. She assures him that she will personally write one. Encouraged by his interest, Helene urges him to continue. Van argues that attending a magic academy without possessing magic is absurd. Helene agrees with the concern, but reminds him that all Night Conference victors shared one thing in common: the rediscovery of magic's principles. Research into potions, magic circles, and related disciplines has shown that magic is far broader than commonly believed. Even defeating mages without magic could become a legitimate field of study, provided Van proves his strength to the world. In short, Helene believes that his success is not impossible. For his final question, Van asks her true motive. He wants to know what she gains by helping him become a noble. Helene asks whether he does not trust her. Van replies that he needs to understand what she stands to gain by turning him into the Lord of the Garuda. She admits that she would benefit in some way but refuses to explain further, keeping him wary. At that moment, Rena calls out for her brother as she runs toward him, asking what he is doing there. She explains that she heard he had fought dangerous people. Van apologizes for worrying her, and she immediately embraces him, scolding him for always saying he would be fine before doing something reckless. Helene watches the exchange and remarks that Van does not need to trust her. Still, she reminds him that with a noble title, he would have the authority to protect his sister and his entire family. She swears this is no deception, invoking the name and honor of the Steiner family. After Helene leaves, Van remains deep in thought, still holding Rena. When their mother learns that he confronted the purifiers, she is deeply shaken. Yet as townspeople arrive to express their gratitude, she recognizes her son's heroism, reminiscent of her late husband, and she smiles. Later, the topic of the academy arises, bringing fresh surprise. Van explains the reward, the recommendation letter, and the decision he has already made. Rina tries to protest, pointing out that the academy is exclusive to mages. Van explains that this is precisely why he wants to go, to prove they are not inferior. He reflects on it carefully, unable to find another way to save everyone. In his previous life, meaning only came through aligning himself with a royal contender. This time, he cannot afford to act without foresight or ignore an opportunity like the one Helene offered. Van has already died once. If there is even a trace of hope, he will seize it. His determination to end discrimination against the Garuda remains unchanged. This resolve shocks both his mother and sister. His mother sees in his eyes the same expression his father once carried. Though she admits she is unsure whether she agrees, she realizes she cannot stop him. When Van asks if she can forgive him, she acknowledges his stubbornness as an inherited trait and accepts reality, prompting a sincere thank you from her son. Changing the subject, she asks how he intends to pay the academy's registration and tuition fees. Van admits this is something he had not considered. Rena offers to help as well, but the thought of burdening them both fills him with despair. Before long, his worries vanish. Without being asked, Helene sends a reward for the defeated purifiers. It is enough to prepare for the journey without anxiety. Aware that Van will face discrimination at the academy, his mother advises him not to let bitterness consume him. She tells him to hold his head high, reminding him that he is her greatest pride. Van accepts her words firmly. Before departing, Rena promises to make mushroom soup when he returns, and Van says he will be looking forward to it. Thus, he begins his journey, waving goodbye from afar, determined to keep his promises this time. After a long journey, he finally reaches the gates of the place where he will spend a significant part of his life. It is the season when young people from across the kingdom gather at the academy. Alexis von Hohenberg steps forward first, presenting a recommendation letter from his own father, prompting the guard to bow respectfully before the noble. Not long after, Elizabeth Krusner steps forward and presents a recommendation letter bearing a duke's signature, earning the same polished respect. Then it becomes the protagonist's turn, and it is immediately clear he will not pass unnoticed. A ripple of whispers spreads at once, with people pointing out the Garuda who had the nerve to show up here. Van remains calm and states that he is doing nothing illegal, because he is only here to apply for the entrance exam. His composure does nothing to soften the irritation on the guard's face. Van then reminds them that the academy's motto is to accept everyone, no matter their status. The younger guard erupts, taking the remark as open provocation. Van senses the situation turning dangerous. If he used force, defeating everyone here would be easy, but it would also explode into chaos. Before it can reach that point, the older guard tells his partner to calm down. At last, someone with a shred of sense speaks. The veteran comments that every year some deluded Garuda tries to enter. In a restrained, almost polite tone, he explains that the academy does not discriminate, but it does require a recommendation letter. What he does not expect is for Van to actually produce one. When one of the guards examines it and notices a noble seal, he blurts out that it must be impossible and insists no noble would ever approve such a thing. Convinced it is forged, he tries to seize the seal. Van catches the man's arm and slams him to the ground. The entire crowd falls silent. The older guard stares, unable to understand how his colleague went down so fast without even realizing what happened. Moments later, another figure approaches, demanding to know why such a commotion is happening at the gates. The two guards immediately drop to their knees in front of the examining lord. The older guard tries to brush it off as nothing serious, but the scene has already drawn too many eyes. With the attention fixed on him, Van introduces himself and explains, evenly, that he carries a recommendation from Helene Steinertz. Most people do not grasp what that name implies, but the examiner recognizes the letter's authenticity at once. Swallowing his pride, the examiner apologizes for the guard's conduct. Even so, the fact that someone like Van has the backing of the Steinertz family causes a fresh wave of unrest. Van quickly understands that Helene is not merely some minor noble. Once Van passes through the academy gates, the atmosphere confirms everything he feared. The place is dominated by the elite. Still, he spots faces he recognizes. Dietrich is among them, far removed from the fearless swordsman Van once knew. Nearby stands Shale, the powerful fire mage. He also sees Lunaris, who will one day become the divine maiden of justice. So many future legends gathered in one place. Unlike Van, they are all destined to become celebrated heroes of the kingdom, praised for fighting on the front lines. But when succession conflicts ignite, those heroes become pieces on a board controlled by corrupt princes. In one way or another, Van had been forced to erase them with his own hands. In this life, out in the open rather than lurking in the shadows, he will have to compete with all of them. It will not be easy, but this is the first step toward changing the kingdom. Then the first bully appears, clearly intent on provoking him. Van asks whether the remark is meant for him, and the answer is obvious from the sneer and the posture alone. Van attempts to assert that he has every right to walk the academy grounds, but the noble acts offended, as if Van's very presence is an insult. Just like before, the man tries to elevate himself by stepping on Van out of habit. For a moment, the assassin inside Van considers lowering his head. Then he remembers his mother's request that he keep his posture. He also recalls Heinz once claiming that self-respect shapes how others treat you. Van stays silent. The bully loses control, grabs Van by the collar, and tries to force submission. Van answers only with a cold stare, making it clear who crossed the line first. The provocator has no idea what he has just started. Naturally, Van reverses the situation and takes control. Instead of struggling head-on, he harmonizes the forces, guiding the opponent's movement and turning his own momentum against him. It is the same method he used on the guard earlier. When the noble hits the ground, Van still offers a hand to help him up. Pride refuses the offer. Anger pushes the noble past the boundary, and he starts to use magic. At the last second, someone shouts for him to stop. The command comes from Prince Heinz, who declares that the Garuda are allies of the kingdom within its hierarchy. The noble apologizes. Heinz adds that he will not use royal blood as an excuse to create divisions. Here, as students, everyone must be treated the same. That includes Van. Van can barely process the fact that Heinz is present. Seeing the ninth prince willing to take the exam like any other candidate only strengthens the image of humility Van once believed in. Heinz's public defense of a Garuda makes many students regard him as almost saintly. Van remembers Heinz mentioning the academy in conversations long ago. Now, in the present, Heinz brings it up again, commenting that Van seems tense. Trying to build rapport, Heinz says that he feels the same anxiety because the exam is notoriously difficult. He then insists there is no need for fear and offers his hand with a warm, practiced smile. Anyone would be disarmed by such kindness. But Van now knows what hides behind that mask. He knows about the filth beneath it all. For a single breath, Van recognizes the opportunity. This would be the perfect moment to kill Heinz. Yet doing so would be reckless, and would destroy everything that brought him here. Heinz keeps his hand extended. Van does not take it. Instead, he offers some excuse and leaves the prince's hand hanging until Heinz lowers it himself. Immediate murmurs break out. Such disrespect towards someone who might become king sparks outrage, especially among those who already resent Van, including the noble who was humiliated moments earlier. Before the tension can erupt again, the examiner steps forward and announces that registrations for this year's exam are now closed. He then states that he will guide the candidates to the entrance of the so-called shaded forest. The announcement makes many go pale with anxiety. At the exam site, with everyone assembled, a coordinator welcomes the applicants and explains that the shaded forest will serve as the arena for this year's entrance test. As everyone already knows, the academy exists to refine the elite and shape those who will govern the kingdom. It has never concerned itself with educating the rabble. Anyone who wishes to remain here must prove they possess at least a minimum level of power. The shaded forest is infamous for holding an enormous concentration of magic, and the candidate's mission is to retrieve a flower saturated with that energy. The bloom is called the tear of heaven, and it grows only in that place. The problem is that the creatures living in the region are also saturated with magic. Van knew there would be a practical trial, but he had not expected to face magical beasts. Direct interference between candidates is forbidden, but cooperation is permitted. Even so, the group must gather enough flowers to guarantee acceptance for the entire team. 2 large teams will be formed, and the time limit is strict. They have only until sunset. Additionally, each candidate receives a badge from the Guardian. It can be used to request rescue if their life is in danger. However, asking for help results in immediate disqualification. With that, the exam officially begins. Students quickly cluster into groups, choosing allies whose skills complement their own. Van ends up alone. He believes solitude will give him more freedom to move. When his turn comes to receive the badge, the examiner hesitates, clearly reluctant to place it in Van's hand. Still, the object is handed over. Van steps forward, leaving under the watchful gaze of that noble once again. Inside the forest, danger arrives immediately. A magical beast appears without warning, giving him no time to prepare. Van identifies it at once as a medium-sized demonic creature. Creatures infused with magic are generally called demonic beasts. They possess physical strength beyond ordinary humans and can wield magic as well, making them more dangerous than many spellcasters. And as Van reflects on it, he realizes that ever since becoming an assassin, until that moment, Van had only fought people. Even so, he does not hesitate. He advances and drives a direct punch into the creature's abdomen. He had long since mastered techniques designed specifically to deal with monsters like this. The blow is not only brutal but reinforced by momentum, generating shockwaves that travel from the surface deep into the body. This method is difficult to apply against thinking opponents, but it is ideal against beasts that attack on instinct alone. During his years as a mercenary, Van had encountered magical beasts on several occasions and had prepared accordingly. Because of that, He briefly remarks to himself how unlucky the two boys hiding in the distance truly are. Still, he does not worry much. The noble and his companion apparently have not even realized a battle is happening. The aristocrat assumes Van must have relied on poison, while the other remembers that interfering in the exam is forbidden. In any case, the examiners have no intention of allowing a Garuda to advance, especially one who openly disrespected a prince. Even if he were to die, no one would be held accountable. Elsewhere, one of the examiners follows the older guard to a secluded gate and orders him to bring the key. Although the knight tries to argue, no reasoning is enough to dissuade him. The examiner intends to use the trump card sealed behind that gate to hunt down the boy who dared to take part in the exam. According to academy regulations, a candidate with a recommendation cannot be directly eliminated, but allowing him to pass would stain the academy's prestige unless an accident occurred. The knight tries to warn him of everything that could go wrong, but the examiner insists. Van is acting alone, and no one of importance has approached him. With the key retrieved, the seal is broken. The examiner orders the cursed beast to be released, commanding it to eliminate the Garuda in the name of the Royal Academy's pride. For reasons he cannot explain, the second examiner feels an ominous unease, sensing that this year's exam will bring serious trouble. When he notices his colleague returning, he asks where he has been. The examiner casually replies that he made preparations for what is to come, leaving the other on high alert. Back to Van, as he continues through the forest, he finally finds what he was looking for. A cluster of flowers exactly matching the description. It is his first time seeing the tears of heaven. If he collects them and returns, his approval is guaranteed. That is when his pursuers finally reveal themselves. One of the nobles remarks that Garuda truly do have keen senses, comparing them to dogs. Van responds that from experience. He knows cowards always attack from behind. The aristocrats bristle, determined to shatter his composure. Deep down, Van knows they are here only because they were humiliated in front of the other candidates. He states that such behavior is expected from prideful children and calmly takes his stance. The noble explodes with rage. Without wasting more time, the two begin preparing their magic. They form a pair consisting of a magical swordsman and a conjuring mage. Magical combat styles are generally divided into three groups. Spellcasters are known simply as mages. Those who channel mana into weapons are magical swordsmen. Those who reinforce their bodies with mana to increase strength and speed are magical martial artists. Teams composed of different styles are usually effective at exploiting weaknesses. Even so, Van quickly realizes that neither of his opponents has real experience killing. They are reckless enough to try, but they lack resolve. Even so, he cannot kill them in self-defense. The death of a noble inevitably brings retaliation from their house. The aristocracy of that era still carries the violent temperament forged during wartime. This time, Van wants to walk a different path. He decides to avoid assassination techniques and simply defeat them. The noble fixates on Van's unshaken gaze and charges forward with his wind blade dance. Van dodges most of it but still receives a shallow cut on his forearm. The attacker is visibly irritated that the strike did not finish him. He begins boasting, declaring that the Voltric family is renowned for its mastery of wind magic. In an arrogant tone, he claims that he will spare Van if he begs for mercy. Van answers with mockery, ironically asking whether the Voltric specialty is cooling people down in the summer. The remark pushes the noble into a fury. Abandoning restraint, he summons a violent storm that seems to tear at the sky itself. Van is forced to retreat, focusing entirely on evasion. This surprises the noble, as Van can clearly see the flow of magic whenever the man's bloodlust spikes. The instant the storm subsides, Van counters with overwhelming force. Seeing his partner fall, the magical swordsman panics, raises his enchanted blade and leaps at Van. Van immediately realizes the enchantment is basic. Without a direct hit, the sword poses no real threat. Normally, a blade moves 2 or 3 times faster than a punch. Even so, thanks to precise footwork, Van ignores the weapon entirely and strikes the wrist, deflecting the attack. Exploiting the opening, he follows up with a short, sharp blow to the arm, sending the swordsman crashing to the ground. Despite their frustration, Van asks whether they intend to continue, making it clear that from this point on, he will not guarantee their safety. Shocked, the noble retreats, swallows his pride, and apologizes. Then Van feels it. A strange presence. He instinctively ignores the aristocrats and, upon grasping the danger, shouts for them to flee immediately. Before any of them can react, the unleashed beast charges in, goring them with its horns and hurling all three through the air. Pain floods their bodies. Van stiffens in alarm as he recognizes the creature. Before them stands a hellbear, a fang-type demonic beast. The nobles cannot understand how such a high-level monster could be here. There is no time to ask questions. The beast is already charging again. Creatures like this are also called cursed fangs. Wrapped in magical power comparable to that of a sage, the monster radiates death. Van warns that if they can still move, now is the moment to run. One of them responds that it is impossible. He shows his leg, mangled from the impact, and states that it is likely fractured. At best, he can barely stand. Van is left with almost no options. Carrying them would slow him down and ensure death. Breaking the rescue badge would not be fast enough. The noble then suggests that Van flee alone, insisting that as a powerful mage he might survive. The companion refuses, declaring that abandonment would disgrace their name. Van proposes that one activate the badge while the other buys time. Eisenbach rejects the idea, stating that dying would be less shameful. To preserve their family's honor, the two decide to fight to the end, heads held high. To Van, this is the worst possible outcome. Now he has to deal with their pride as well. Furious, he shouts that if they intend to fight, then they should fight to win instead of dying uselessly. The noble considers this arrogance, but with no alternatives left, cooperation becomes the only option. Back at the forest entrance, the second examiner remarks that the timing seems right. The first asks what he means, but the question is ignored. Instead, he asks whether any badge has been activated. Hearing that none have been broken feels strange to the first examiner, and disturbingly pleasant to the second. That means Van has not even had time to request rescue. Before the exam began, the candidate's belongings were confiscated. The examiner had used one of those items to imprint Van's scent onto the beast. He now believes the boy has already been reduced to dust and waits confidently, unable to suppress his laughter. Back in the forest, as the monster advances, the three boys brace themselves. Van shouts that he will hold the creature while the nobles attack with everything they have. Waltraich refuses to take orders, but the beast closes in too fast. Sensing the imminent danger, Van throws himself forward at the last moment. This time, he uses assassination techniques, repeating the crushing blow from earlier and turning the monster's own speed against it. Unlike the smaller beast before, the effect is not decisive, but the impact is real. The technique works by predicting movement and striking at the point of origin. When a quadruped attacks, the head always moves first. Van disperses the force through multiple layers of penetration, but panic rises when he realizes he is not reaching the inner organs. His younger body, reduced in muscle mass and height after returning 10 years into the past, is noticeably weaker. He has done all he can for now. He shouts, and Waltraich casts the Scarab spell. Blades of wind crash into the hellbear. Immediately after, Eisenbach charges with his enchanted sword, but the monster's hide proves too tough. To make matters worse, the beast enters a berserk state. Van yells for everyone to retreat, but the creature charges again, accelerating to full speed and generating violent currents of wind. When Van looks back, he sees both allies collapsed and unable to move, though still alive. Waltraich managed to deflect part of the impact with magic, but another charge would kill him. Eisenbach already believes this is the end. His sword has done nothing. Still standing, Van declares that he will try one more time. To the noble's shock, he states that on the next attempt, the three of them will finish the monster together. Waltraich questions whether Van has not realized that their magic is ineffective. Van responds by suggesting that he mix stones into the spell to increase its destructive force. For Eisenbach, he advises focusing on driving the blade into the creature's weakest points. Waltraich asks in disbelief what Van is thinking. To him, it is obvious they have no chance. Van could still escape, and Waltraich admits he would not blame him after everything they tried to do earlier. Van answers that he is not here for revenge. He explains that his only wish is for his race to be recognized as part of the kingdom. Because of that, he cannot abandon companions from the same nation he wants to belong to. The words hit Waltraich like a blow. Reality sets in, along with crushing guilt over his actions. At that moment, the hellbear prepares for its final charge. Van notices and shouts for them to execute the plan. On Van's signal, Waltraich activates his wind blade dance again. Following the suggestion, he incorporates stones into the spell, renaming it Black Dust Sky Cutter. A dark, sand-laden blade descends violently upon the fanged beast. The attack obscures its vision. Van announces that it is his turn and charges forward. The shoulders of quadrupeds function differently from those of humans. They are not directly connected to the spine, allowing flexibility in the front legs but sacrificing stability. Using this knowledge, Van activates his rotation technique and knocks the monster off balance. As it falls, he shouts that the heart is located at the front base between the forelegs. Eisenbach does not hesitate this time. He leaps forward, but his inexperience causes a brief pause when he meets the beast's ferocious gaze. Even so, he acts as instructed and drives the sword in. Waltraich cries out in celebration, believing they have won. Van, however, feels no relief. He realizes something is wrong. The strike did not reach the heart. Perhaps the moment of hesitation was enough. The hellbear begins to recover. As a last defense, the monster unleashes a destructive roar, a rare ability among predatory beasts that channels magic through sound. A massive shockwave erupts, blasting everything around it into the air. Eisenbach collapses onto the ground, blood spilling freely, and in that instant he feels a sharp pain that tells him his internal organs have been damaged. As if that were not enough, the beast looms close enough to tear him apart where he lies. At that speed and distance, survival seems impossible. Before the noble can be finished off, Van steps directly in front of him. Among the harmony techniques, this one is known as spiral. It does not rely on overpowering strength, but instead redirects the enemy's force into a rotating motion that drives it into the ground. Even so, the beast is far beyond control, and Van knows he cannot deflect all that power. Only one final option remains. Even if it destroys his body, it is still better than dying here. Van shouts desperately for his companions to run as fast as they can. Eisenbach gathers what little strength remains and barely manages to stand. Meanwhile, Van grips the creature's horns, holding it back with everything he has, though exhaustion is already carved into his expression. Unlike Van, the monster only grows stronger. With a violent surge, it throws him aside, sending him crashing into a tree with bone-rattling force. Waltrich tries to move, but Van yells for him to stay back. The beast inevitably charges again, and Waltrich rushes forward despite himself, trying to save Van. Even injured, Van has already decided that he will not die here. He murmurs softly that his heart should sink and the chains binding him should be freed. Something dreadful is about to happen, but before it can unfold, an ice spell slams into the front paw of the monster. The impact makes the beast howl in pain and collapse, stopping it just short of Van. What shocks everyone most is the source of the spell. It comes from Prince Heinz himself, something none of the three had expected. The nobles urgently warn that it is too dangerous for royalty to remain on the battlefield. Heinz answers that protecting the kingdom's citizens is the duty of royalty, a declaration that visibly stirs both nobles. To Van, this scene feels painfully familiar. This is exactly how Heinz always earned people's trust before leading them to their deaths. Now, shining like a false beacon of hope, Heinz proposes that the four of them form an alliance. Van immediately shouts that he refuses. Confusion and irritation flicker across the nobles' faces, mirrored by the prince's own expression. Even so, Van firmly repeats that he has no intention of cooperating. He states clearly that the power of a royal heir is unnecessary. Waltrich demands respect, while Eisenbach points out that Heinz just saved their lives. Van retorts that he would have resolved everything alone if the prince had not interfered. Heinz asks whether Van truly does not need help. Van answers that he does, but as he walks toward the monster, he tells the prince to stay quiet and watch, as royalty usually does. Van then warns that the beast is moving again, and moments later it charges straight at them. This time, Eisenbach insists on at least landing a single blow. Van urges calm, stating that running now would only waste their lives. Waltrich comments that he has mana for only one more attack, but Van tells both of them, including Heinz, to focus on his signals. There is something different in Van's resolve now, and it spreads to the others. He moves to intercept the monster, recalling how terrified he felt earlier. Because of that fear, he believes he can win without resorting to the forbidden technique. So far, 3 of his harmony techniques have failed against the Fang beast. The monster begins to recognize them as genuine threats and grows more cautious. Van dodges a sweeping strike, leaps, and spots a brief opening. The creature roars and pursues him, but Van keeps evading, using the enemy's own body as leverage. Waltrich cannot believe such speed is possible without magic, and neither can the prince. By shifting his center of gravity without pushing off the ground, Van eliminates preparatory movement entirely. This technique is known only among the highest-level martial artists. Watching him kick, leap and escape a demonic beast without magic makes no sense to either observer. In a final maneuver, Van steps directly onto the monster's head, leaving the nobles stunned. Heinz, however, understands that attacks without magic are little more than caresses to a creature of this level. As the beast continues fighting, he believes the situation is about to spiral out of control. Van, on the other hand, declares that this is exactly what he wants. His real goal is to provoke it. Soon, the signs of a destructive roar begin to appear. At that moment, Van shouts for Waltrich to use his wind magic. Waltrich obeys instantly, forcing stones into the spell and sending them into the creature's mouth. The debris blocks its airways, causing the beast to collapse. Without hesitation, Van leaps onto it, meeting it face to face, and prepares his crushing double strike known as Twin. The blows land simultaneously at the center of the demonic beast's skull. Shockwaves from both sides converge into a single point, like ripples colliding on water. The result leaves the creature completely incapacitated. With the first steps complete, Van signals Eisenbach, who spins his sword once and cleaves the beast apart. The nobles stand frozen in disbelief, struggling to comprehend that they have defeated a high-level monster. Eisenbach asks what Van is doing. Van answers only by staring silently at Heinz, then turning away and offering his hand to help Eisenbach up. Eisenbach admits that his insides feel sore, as though they are injured. Van explains that sound-based magic can be partially countered by blocking the ears, and Eisenbach states that he will never forget that lesson. With the immediate danger gone, attention turns to the objective. To Van's surprise, where there were once many flowers, only 2 remain. This is the consequence of forming large groups, just as warned at the beginning. Van thinks quickly, aware that time is running out. Before he can speak, the nobles take the initiative. They collect the remaining flowers and decide how to distribute them. Naturally, the first is handed to Heinz, because he is a prince. Van questions why a flower should be given to someone who merely watched, but Waltrich ignores him entirely. The second flower is then placed directly into Van's hands. Van asks if he is sure. The boy replies that he does not want to owe anyone anything and introduces himself as Falk. Eisenbach follows, saying his name is Ralph. Surprised by their attitude, the protagonist introduces himself as Van and they exchange brief greetings, aware they may never meet again. At that moment, Heinz intervenes. He picks up several withered flowers from the ground and revitalizes them with light magic, astonishing everyone present. He asks them to accept this gesture, assuring them that no one will be harmed. Van notices the sun sinking toward the horizon and warns that they must leave the forest immediately. His tone sounds like an order, which irritates Fox slightly. Before they depart, the prince draws Van's attention. Heinz remarks that Van had covered his feet with dirt earlier. He then mentions having heard of a movement technique used to hide tracks, something commonly associated with assassins. Combining that with the martial techniques Van demonstrated, Heinz directly asks whether Van is, or has ever been, an assassin. Heinz has many enemies. After conquering several territories, the king hardened the kingdom's laws and took foreign princesses as wives. Heinz's mother, however, had already been a noble, becoming the fifth queen and the first from the kingdom of Firenze. Because of this, Heinz's brothers and their mothers feared his rise to the throne. Assassination attempts could come from anywhere, and Heinz was always prepared. If Van were an infiltrator, Heinz intended to eliminate him on the spot. Van does not expect his old habits to betray him like this. Technically, he is a trained assassin. Admitting that, however, would be suicide. He chooses to feign ignorance. The prince immediately notices the evasion. Van makes it clear through his stance that he will not back down if Heinz wishes to settle matters that way. The air between them grows heavy, and a clash seems inevitable. When Van steps forward, Falk instinctively moves in front of him. Heinz maintains a stern expression, but in the next instant Van appears at his side, stating that he was only joking. Falk cannot comprehend how Van moved so fast. Van uses the moment to attempt easing the tension with polite behavior. Heinz, however, ignores the effort entirely, having noticed something far more important. Van deliberately does not take advantage of the opening he created. At that point it becomes obvious that this was nothing more than a test. The prince, dissatisfied, demands a clear answer and repeats the question, referring again to the earlier behavior and asking directly whether the boy is an assassin. Van responds that it was Helene who taught him those techniques, along with every other form of hand-to-hand combat he knows. Internally, he apologizes for using her name as a shield. The moment the prince hears that the recommendation came from the Steinhardt house, his expression changes completely. Ralph begins explaining that this duchy is far from an ordinary noble family. Van had already sensed that Helene was someone important, though he lacked the details. Heinz then clarifies that she was known as the Lady of the Ice Flower. She ranked above even the academy's top students, so it was natural that someone trained by her would be extraordinary. Moreover, the Steinhardt house was the oldest family still serving the kingdom, which made the idea of them sending assassins absurd. Heinz asks how Van obtained the recommendation, but the boy has nothing more to add. From the prince's perspective, the letter had likely been given to cultivate a future retainer of the house. After witnessing Van's abilities, Heinz comments that he himself would have recruited the boy had he arrived sooner. As for what had truly chased them in the forest, he suspects it was simply the beast. Heinz admits that he has no idea how such a creature appeared there in the first place. Still, since everyone survived, he expresses his thanks. For the nobles, that gratitude is the highest possible honor. For Van, it means very little. Once again, Falk asks Van to be patient and tells him to stop acting disrespectfully. Instead of seeking praise or approval, Van responds with complete indifference. This only deepens Heinz's curiosity about the strange boy. Back at the forest entrance, the successful candidates begin to gather, while those who failed lower their heads in silence. The second examiner counts the numbers, and the first announces that, including the prince, 4 candidates are still missing. The news unsettles the second examiner, who fears that something may have gone terribly wrong. The forest had only been stocked with monsters that Heinz himself could defeat. He never intended to put the prince in danger because of his own actions. Just then, a figure steps out of the trees. The second examiner feels relief, assuming it must be Heinz. Instead, Van emerges first and mockingly asks whether everyone has gathered to welcome him. Unlike his colleague, the second examiner immediately asks how the boy is still alive. The first examiner does not understand the comment, and Van questions whether he should not be. Realizing his mistake, the examiner dodges the issue, saying he is merely impressed. Van retorts that he is not the only one surprised. Right behind him, the noble candidates appear, dragging the corpse of the beast with them. Gasps spread through the crowd as they recognize the fanged monster that attacked them inside the forest. Its severed head serves as undeniable proof. Even though they know exactly why it happened, both examiners feign surprise. Still, the second examiner's tone sounds almost accusatory. When the first asks him to repeat himself, he hides once again behind the excuse of being impressed. Heinz steps forward and describes the confrontation as a magnificent battle. Seeing the prince alive nearly causes the second examiner to panic. When questioned, Heinz explains that he happened to be nearby during the fight. This revelation is disastrous for the second examiner. If it became known that he was responsible for unleashing the beast, execution would be inevitable. Heinz notices the man's nervous behavior, and for the third time, the examiner claims surprise, even offering exaggerated wishes for the kingdom's prosperity. The suspicion is obvious. Heinz then states honestly that his own involvement in the battle was minimal. He emphasizes that the victory belonged to the three candidates, especially Van. The examiners struggle to believe it, as do the surrounding students. Ralph openly praises Van, while Falk admits without hesitation that he followed the boys' commands during the fight. The second examiner mutters that such a thing would be impossible for a Garuda. However, with the recommendation from the Steinhardt house, even Heinz finds nothing strange about it. Van knows perfectly well that Helene never taught him any of those techniques, but he cannot say so. Heinz's public approval, combined with the recommendation letter, begins to shift the crowd's perception. The first examiner bows deeply toward Van, thanking him as a servant of the kingdom for protecting the prince. Van tries to explain that he did not protect anyone and merely survived. Still, he raises his flower, prompting the other two to do the same. The examiners exchange looks, and it becomes clear that the second must act. He calls out the prince's name, then the two noble candidates. Finally, with visible discomfort, he calls the last name. With a trembling voice, he announces Van as having passed the entrance exam. In this chaotic fashion, the boy secures his place at the academy. As for the appearance of the beast, the first examiner takes responsibility for handling all the bureaucratic consequences. Several days later, before the new generation of talents, the academy's director gives a speech declaring that the institution seeks more than mere skill. According to him, true nobility of spirit is what matters most, becoming the sword and shield of the kingdom. In his past life, Van never imagined standing among nobles. This was only a small step, but it marked the beginning of his goal to end the discrimination against his people. From high above the ceremony grounds, Helene watches everything unfold with a proud smile. After confirming that everything proceeded as expected, Helene goes where she is summoned. She enters a luxurious chamber with 5 chairs, one of which is reserved for her. All signs suggest that every important member of that group is already present. Among them is the sword princess, Karina Luthier. The silver strategist, Amelia Rodenwald, is also there. The silence is broken by Arnulf Clovius, whose calm demeanor dominates the room, as he explains that they have gathered to discuss a single issue. The 8th prince, Onus Ferrania, completes the group, serving as the one responsible for foreign affairs. Helene already knows what this is about. Amelia and Arnulf agree that something unprecedented has occurred. For the first time since its founding, the Academy has accepted a student of Garuda descent. Karina complains that the Academy has grown too lenient, a sentiment the 8th prince shares. More than that, Onus demands to know why the recommendation came from one of the 5 brilliant crowns. His tone makes it clear that he expects an explanation. Helene's choice places her in a delicate position. The Academy is filled with sons and daughters of nobles, all wielding great magical power and equally great pride. When that pride clashes, conflict is inevitable. To restrain such chaos, a group of idealistic students once took on the mantle of the 5 brilliant crowns. Once again, Onus asks what Helene was thinking when she recommended a Garuda. She answers that she simply acknowledged his strength, a response Karina finds ridiculous. In Karina's view, the Garuda are cursed by the gods for lacking true power. Amelia agrees, stating that without magic, one cannot be a sword or shield for the kingdom. Onus supports this belief, as it reflects the prevailing ideology of the nation. Helene counters that this belief is merely convenient, embraced by those unwilling to think beyond established norms. Her words strike the prince, leaving him visibly offended. Arnulf then proposes a simple solution: test the boy and judge for themselves. Onus approves of the idea and asks Helene what she thinks. If Van proves weak, her recommendation will be questioned. Even so, she does not object. Instead, she warns that whoever is chosen must not underestimate him, or they will end up humiliated. To everyone's surprise, Karina volunteers to personally test the boy's abilities. Even the prince does not expect someone from the 5 chairs to step forward for this task. Helene asks whether something about Van had drawn Karina's attention. Karina answers coldly that she simply wanted to crush him, if only to shatter Helene's confident expression. Back in the protagonist's daily routine at the academy, the atmosphere is filled with chatter about lessons, assignments, and unfinished work. A full week has passed since Van's enrollment. To his own surprise, he has been living in relative peace, aside from the occasional provocation that never quite escalates. One day during class, the most arrogant instructor abruptly asks whether Van can explain the theory of the 4 elements in magic. The room falls into immediate silence. The question is far beyond the level expected of first-year students, and even the teacher seems to regret asking it. In his mind, the teacher already assumes that a Garuda would not even be able to read. Van, however, calmly answers that the theory is a method for stabilizing 4 fundamental factors: flow, density, resonance, and fixation. He adds that the concept prevents magical stagnation, restores energy balance, and forms the foundation of modern spell formulas. He explains all of this with a faint smile. From that moment on, the constant harassment simply stops. More than that, Van begins to make friends. Rolf approaches him one day, patting him on the back and inviting him to lunch. Van remarks that he has been a little worried about both Rolf and Falk. When Rolf asks why, Van avoids answering directly and instead gestures toward the cafeteria. The response leaves Ralph confused, but he follows anyway. This brief period of calm ends when a girl appears behind them in the hallway. Van asks what she wants, assuming at first that it is something trivial, as they have merely brushed past one another. To avoid trouble, both sides apologize politely. Without warning, the girl draws her sword and presses the tip against Van's throat, throwing Ralph into immediate panic. She declares that commoners are supposed to kneel before nobles. According to her, in the case of a Garuda, the bare minimum would be to kiss the ground. Van responds calmly that there is no reason for that. Since everyone present is a student of the academy, the girl insists on reminding him of his place within the hierarchy. Ralph speaks up and states that this has gone too far. She replies that she has no intention of shedding blood, as long as Van demonstrates obedience appropriate to his status. That, however, is something Van clearly has no intention of doing. Basic respect between seniors and newcomers makes sense to him, but when someone tries to enforce that hierarchy through force, his instincts push him to do the opposite. He leans forward against the blade. The girl quickly pulls it back to keep him from grabbing it, but Van twists the weapon anyway and forces it aside. Her stance collapses. Reflexively, she tightens her grip. The weight of her body transfers onto the thin blade. With bending and torsion combined, the metal reaches its limit and snaps cleanly, as easily as slicing vegetables with a sharp knife. Van asks whether zinc was mixed into the sword and comments, with open disdain, that it is unfortunate to be threatened with such a common weapon. Zinc blades are cheap, durable against impacts, and useful for training, but utterly unreliable in real combat. The girl retorts that real swords are forbidden on campus and adds that she is not part of the 5 brilliant crowns. In her view, her role in this encounter is already complete. At that moment, Karina appears. She demands punishment for disrespecting a veteran and for damaging another student's property. Ralph can hardly believe that the sword princess herself is standing there. Van, on the other hand, immediately recognizes her from the blood-soaked battlefields of his past life, where thousands had fallen by her hand. He cannot help but wonder why someone like her is inside the academy. During his first life as an assassin, several rebellions shook the kingdom. Behind the scenes operated a militant remnant of the purification sect known as the Circle of White Annihilation. Among them, the most feared was Karina, a demonic swordswoman responsible for the deaths of countless heroes. Although the kingdom eventually destroyed the circle at tremendous cost, the chaos it left behind ignited the war over the throne's succession. Van had only seen her once on the battlefield. Even now, he does not understand why a former enemy of the kingdom is present here. Breaking the silence, Karina announces that an additional punishment is required. According to her, standing in silence before a veteran is also an act of disrespect. Van immediately apologizes, stating that he did not recognize her as someone of higher rank. The explanation only irritates her further. Ralph anxiously tries to clarify that she is one of the 5 brilliant crowns. Van admits that he does not even know what that means. Briefly, they explain that the 5 crowns are a disciplinary council composed of the academy's most exceptional students. Karina has been a member since she enrolled at the age of 13. Van shows genuine surprise at this, and Karina thanks him for the reaction. It is clear that she belongs to the highest nobility, her status concealed after she became a rebel. For a fleeting moment, Van considers that this could be his chance to eliminate her and prevent a future rebellion. If she were removed now, the succession war might never begin, and Heinz would never rise to power. Despite this, Karina resumes speaking about punishment, stating that continuing to ramble before her is yet another insult. Van shifts into a defensive stance. She warns him that she will make him remember why she is allowed to wield a real sword. Her posture is unmistakable. The same stance she used before delivering swift execution strikes too fast to see. Ralph shouts for Van to just apologize. Van pushes his friend aside and says that he also needs to confirm something. Karina considers that statement foolish. They stare at each other from opposite ends of the hall, as the surrounding students watch in breathless tension. In the blink of an eye, Karina appears on the other side of the hall. Her sword is already sheathed. Van collapses, wounded. Ralph rushes to his side, but Karina says nothing. Instead of continuing, she decides to postpone the punishment. In her judgment, Van is not someone who should be exterminated immediately. She leaves with her subordinate, leaving Van injured and restless on the floor. Minutes later, the subordinate asks why she spared the novice. Already some distance away, Karina finally reveals the truth. She drops to her knees, clutching her body in pain. She did not spare Van out of mercy. She spared him because she herself was injured, to her subordinate's shock. Karina explains that she had read about something similar in martial arts texts, techniques involving pressure points. The pain she feels makes proper movement nearly impossible. The subordinate asks whether they exchanged direct blows. Karina knows with certainty that this was not the case. The moment she closed in, her intention was to strike Van's neck. At the last instant, Van ducked and countered, aiming directly at a vital point without hesitation. Her instinctive reaction was to retreat, which altered the sword's trajectory. At the same time, Van's hands moved with flawless precision toward the pressure point. That was the start of a combined technique, one taught only in certain sword schools. It is knowledge Van should never have possessed. To the subordinate, Karina is the clear victor since she remains standing. He declares that the outcome is obvious, and Karina agrees aloud. Deep down, however, she knows the truth. Strikes to pressure points are not lethal. That means Van tried to defeat her without causing permanent harm. In a real battle, the result could have been very different. And more than anything else, she realizes she underestimated him. Annoyed, Karina declares that next time she will come far more prepared. From the protagonist's point of view once more, Ralph carries Van through the corridors and asks what it was that Van wanted to confirm during the confrontation. He explains that he had been worried and, naturally, curious. Van, however, dismisses the matter as unimportant. He reflects that despite Karina's harsh words, she did not use a real sword, and her magic felt different from the terror she embodied in the past. That alone suggests a measure of restraint. Almost absent-mindedly, Van even remarks that she was surprisingly kind. The clash convinces him that the Karina of this time is not the same monster he once faced. As they head toward the infirmary, Van begins to think that perhaps changing her future is possible, rather than killing her outright. The next day, Van enters the classroom and walks to his desk as usual. This time, however, he feels far too many eyes on him. He takes his seat at the edge of the room, but soon hears whispers spreading about how he challenged one of the 5 brilliant crowns. The attention makes him uneasy. Not long after, Ralph and Falk arrive and tell him to ignore those fools. Both seem determined to help him apologize. Van makes it clear that apologizing is not his intention. He comments that when they first met, neither of them seemed so intrusive. Even so, he thanks them for their concern and states that he will deal with the situation on his own. If he truly wants to prevent a future tragedy, he knows he must confront Karina now. In any case, he does not believe he has anything to fear from the Academy's disciplinary elites. At that moment, the Lady of the Ice Flower appears and asks to speak with Van. Naturally, he questions why, pointing out that class is about to begin. Helene simply insists, explaining that it will not take long. Driven by curiosity, Van agrees, and the two leave the classroom together. This alone shocks everyone present. Not only does Van know the Lady of the Ice Flower, but he speaks to her casually as well. Later, in a secluded area, Helene explains that she has been assigned to test his abilities. Van comments that she could have said that from the beginning. She apologizes, admitting that she did not expect events to escalate so quickly, especially where Karina was concerned. Helene describes Karina as the pinnacle of the noble youth and the future head of House Luthier, despite her young age. Van responds that he does not see her merely as a prodigy. He explains that it feels as though Karina has discarded everything in her life except the sword. Helene is surprised by this observation, but she admits it is accurate. She explains that Karina was originally an illegitimate child of House Luthier, denied even basic noble education. At 10 years old, however, she defeated her 17-year-old half-brother in a casual duel. He was the legitimate heir. Because of that talent, Karina was acknowledged as a true daughter of the house. Still, she grew up surrounded by jealousy and devoid of affection. As for how Helene knows all this, she comments that nobles are fond of gossip. Even so, before Karina enrolled in the academy, Helene once saw her alone at a gathering. She recalls the image clearly: Karina standing apart from everyone, staring at her father from behind with an empty gaze no child should have. Van suggests that Helene should have spoken to her then. Helene replies that she could not. As members of great houses, any forced interaction would have been taken as a political provocation. Van calls it an unbearably difficult situation. Helene admits that she herself was bound by those expectations at the time. Karina, however, seemed indifferent to such constraints. Helene confesses that she always felt the girl might one day walk a dangerous path. Van asks what Helene would do if that happened. She answers that she would stop her, because she had avoided that responsibility for far too long. At that moment, Van finally understands everything. Helene's magical skill rivaled that of the heroes who later shaped the kingdom. Yet her name never became widely known. Van realizes that she must have tried to stop Karina when the girl turned rebel, and likely died in that confrontation, never having the chance to build her own legacy. Even while speaking words heavy enough to move anyone, Helene asks Van not to treat her with pity. He replies that he understands, but admits that hearing her story only strengthens his resolve. Now, he is determined to crush whatever regret and darkness Karina carries. In the past, no one had been able to stop her. This time, Van believes he has a real chance to cut the evil off at its root. Helene quietly confesses that she may have been hoping to hear exactly that. She asks whether Van already has a plan. He answers that he would never act without one. When she asks what that plan is, he tells her to follow him after class. Once the day's activities end, Van's classmates approach him again. Falk comments that people are becoming far too involved in his life. Ralph admits that he is curious about what happened after Van left with Helene, and Falk agrees. Moments later, they spot Van ahead. He is not standing still. Instead, he is already engaged in combat with the Lady of the Ice Flower herself. The shockwave from their clash throws both observers backward. Helene sarcastically asks where Van was looking as she activates her ice magic, unleashing the Garden of 1,000 Thorns. Ralph and Falk are left completely speechless. At the last possible instant, Van steps in front of them. With a precise martial strike, he shatters the spell entirely. Then he turns to the two boys and remarks that they arrived just in time. Immediately afterward, he asks them to join him. Footsteps echo sharply against the stone as Karina walks down the long corridor, sunlight slanting in through tall windows. The eighth prince calls out to Karina in a relaxed tone, greeting her as if this were a casual encounter. Karina turns toward him with a sharp glance and asks whether he needs something, addressing him with formal respect as Her Highness. The eighth prince replies that he is not trying to rush her, but he asks when she intends to deal with the Garuda they previously discussed. Karina answers that it will happen very soon and adds that the item she requested from her family has finally arrived. The prince reacts with quiet interest, noting his surprise at hearing that. At that moment, a student staggers forward, straining as she drags an ornate coffin bound in thick chains, the metal clattering loudly against the floor. Bent over and drenched in sweat, the student asks Lady Karina where it should be taken. Karina orders that it be carried to her room and emphasizes that it must be handled carefully. The eighth prince watches the chained chest, and remarks that this must be the object he had heard rumors about. She questions whether using something like that might be excessive for a Garuda. He responds that it is not excessive in the slightest. For someone like that, someone like a bare blade given human form, there is no more appropriate stage. The eighth prince smiles faintly. Not long after, a notice spreads throughout the academy, drawing students together in front of the announcement board. It declares that Karina Luthier, one of the 5 brilliant crowns, has challenged first-year student Van Kruger to a duel as punishment for disrupting public order. The proclamation names the Royal Academy's great training grounds, known as the White Ring Arena, describing it as a sacred place reserved for official duels and special trials. Beneath the open sky, Van stands alone in the arena, calmly stretching and loosening his body as the wind moves around him. The eighth prince takes a seat nearby, observing in silence. The stands gradually fill, and Helene quietly notes how large the crowd has become. Falk and Ralph whisper that the atmosphere feels heavy, and one of them remarks that no one truly believes this will be a fair duel. When the other asks what he means, Helene states plainly that this is not a duel at all, but punishment. Most of the crowd assumes that a clash between a 5-crown and a Garuda can only end in a one-sided slaughter. Ralph scoffs at that assumption and says that may be the common-sense conclusion, but Kaff insists that they know better. With a confident grin, he claims that Van is not someone who can be judged by common sense. Helene lifts her gaze and comments that someone else seems to share that opinion. High above them, Heinz stands, watching with a relaxed smile. The eighth prince notices him and silently questions why that man would bother attending a duel like this. His expression tightens as he continues to stare. Noticing his brother's gaze, Heinz smiles which irritate his brother. A crushing pressure suddenly descends upon the White Ring Arena, making the air tremble and the crowd stiffen. Helene sits rigidly with 2 students, her eyes unblinking. Nearby, the eighth prince leans forward, his posture tense as the atmosphere turns ominous. On the arena floor, Karina stands with her eyes closed, one hand gripping a chain as faint purple lights drift around her. The chain scrapes harshly across the stone. Ralph stares wide-eyed and asks what that could possibly be. Helene breaks into a cold sweat, thinking that Karina could not truly have brought that out. In the center of the arena rests a massive coffin, like chest, and Karina stands before it, the heavy chain coiled in her grasp. Van faces her with a thin smile and remarks that it must be his coffin, adding that it is surprisingly thoughtful of her. Karina glares and orders him to stop joking. Violet light begins to seethe from the coffin as blades rise within it, and Karina states that such a coffin is far too good for someone like him. Van freezes in shock, left momentarily speechless. The name Sword Coffin hangs over the scene as the interior expands into a radiant armory. It is explained that this artifact is a portable armory passed down through generations of the Sword Saints of House Luthier. Kaff mutters in disbelief, wondering what the Sword Saints had been thinking when they created something so monstrous. Karina reaches into the storm of light and draws a sword, her eyes burning with hatred. She declares that she will make him regret this, specifying that he will regret the day a Garuda ever set foot in the academy. Van answers coldly that she should not be the one speaking of regret and vows that he will shatter her precious coffin into pieces. Van tilts his head slightly and asks how the signal to begin will be given. Karina replies that it already has and her body moves instantly. She advances in a blur, blade first, the violet circle behind her flaring as the chain whips through the air. Van's red eyes narrow, and he vanishes from the path of the strike, reappearing so close that Karina is forced to twist mid-swing. His fist and her sword collide with a sharp burst. Van remarks that, as expected, her reflexes are excellent. Karina answers only with silence, her stare hardening as both reset and rush forward again. In the stands, students recoil. One shouts that it is far too fast, while another blurts out that it looks like instant movement magic. A third snaps back that it cannot be magic, because Van is a Garuda. Kaff clutches his head and says that no matter how many times he sees it, it looks exactly like magic. Someone names the technique Phantom Step, and Helene adds that this is indeed what it is called. He can only stare and ask what on earth that means. It is explained that most people move by pushing off the ground, creating a visible preparatory motion. Van does not do that at all. He slides his entire body forward by manipulating his center of gravity and rotating his pelvis, which is identified as the true nature of his footwork. Ralph comments that even with the explanation, he still cannot understand it, adding that it is footwork they cannot even read from this distance. Kath agrees. Helene observes that for Karina, seeing it happen directly in front of her must feel like teleportation. She narrows her eyes, recalling that she felt the same way the first time she witnessed it in the Gerudo Florist. On the arena floor, the fight compresses into close quarters. Kath judges that this is a favorable development, noting that Van holds the advantage at close range. Ralph points out that a longsword cannot swing properly at that distance. Karina adjusts immediately. She slides her grip up the blade, grasping the unsharpened section near the hilt, and drives the weapon forward with short, controlled power. Van's expression tightens as he braces and catches the blow at close range, the clash scraping violently. Van jumps back and Karina asks if he thought she wouldn't be able to cut him at close range. Van smiles nervously. Ralph exclaims that this is half-swording. It is explained that longswords have an unsharpened section called the ricasso, and that half-swording involves gripping it to control the blade in tight spaces. He comments that while it is practical on the battlefield, it is not a technique usually taught to noble ladies. Falk adds that perhaps the rumors of her becoming the next sword saint are true. Helene cuts in and states that against Van, this is a poor choice. Karina presses forward with that tight control, but Van slips inside her angle and answers with sheer speed, closing the distance before her stance can settle. The force of their collision ripples across the tiles as Van drives through her space, striking and breaking her balance. Karina is hurled upward and back, and Van pursues relentlessly, shouting that he is not finished as he keeps the pressure on. From the stands, the Eighth Prince watches with folded arms and remarks that Van is indeed not finished, noting that Karina is being forced to take hits. Beside him, it is explained that for magic swordsmen, attacks lacking magic power are extremely difficult to avoid. It is then stated that this is precisely why Van's blows containing no magic at all become unreadable to them. Karina steadies herself, her aura swelling as she scoffs and asks what difference that makes. She declares with confidence that there is no way attacks relying solely on physical strength could ever pierce her magical defenses. Karina's eyes suddenly widen as a wave of cold runs through her body. For a brief moment, she freezes, as if her senses cannot fully register what has just occurred. She plants her sword against the ground to steady herself, staring forward in disbelief. Then she clutches the side of her head and demands to know what Van has done to her. Van responds with a faint smirk, saying that it could be anything, and casually suggests that perhaps her mana control is simply sloppy. Karina grits her teeth, caught between fury and genuine confusion. The technique is identified as Could, Empty Hall. It is explained as a method that uses wind pressure generated by a palm strike to send a shock directly into the semicircular canals of the inner ear, disrupting balance and perception. Across the arena, gasps ripple through the crowd as Karina is forced backward. One student blurts out, asking what is happening, while another shouts in disbelief that Lady Karina is being pushed back. High in the stands, the Eighth Prince snaps angrily, demanding to know what Karina is doing and chastising her for disgracing the title of nobility. Nearby, Heinz watches in silence with his arms crossed and a grin. On the arena floor, Karina hunches slightly, shielding herself as the disorientation lingers. Van advances with his palm raised and asks calmly whether they should end this soon. A purple-haired girl cries out in alarm for Lady Karina as Van closes the distance. Karina's expression shifts, sharpening into something dangerous. A magic circle blooms overhead as violent violet light surges outward, flooding the arena. She drops low and drives her power into the ground through her blade. The stone tiles explode outward in a crushing wave, carving the arena floor into a massive crater. The crowd stares down at the devastation, and one student can only choke out that he cannot believe what he is seeing. Van staggers back with his arms raised, visibly shaken. He realizes that Karina had only swung a sword filled with magic. Yet even without a direct hit, the shock alone rattled him to his core. He understands then why generations of sword saints required the sword coffin to wield such power safely. Within the storm of mana, Karina rises and declares the name of her technique Himmelsters, the Heavenfall Blade. She adds that, as demonstrated, ordinary swords cannot withstand it, calling that its only drawback. Watching from above, the Eighth Prince mutters that this is truly Karina, then realizes she has been holding back until now. A calm voice beside him agrees, stating that anyone struck by that blow would be reduced to dust. Van steadies his breathing and tells Karina that she ought to treat her weapon with more care. Karina replies that she will, then smiles with chilling certainty and declares that she will finish everything with the next strike. The entire arena seems to hold its breath. One student stares at the towering pillar of power and panics, wondering if Karina truly intends to kill him. Another scoffs, saying it is only natural punishment for a Garuda who dared defy a noble. Ralph turns pale, thinking that if such an attack lands, Van will surely die. Falk urges calm. He insists that as long as it does not connect directly, Van could avoid it using Phantom Step. Only time will tell. Helene watches without blinking and comments that Van's attacks are landing, but not with enough force to bring Karina down in a single strike. She adds that Karina's Heavenfall blade could annihilate Van instantly. She explains that Karina could deliberately endure Van's blows, just to release Heavenfall blade at point-blank range, and warns that even avoiding a direct hit would not save him from the shockwave without magical protection. Fox swallows hard and wonders aloud what Van plans to do next. Below, surrounded by Violet Has, Karina faces Van and tells him one last time to accept the status he was born into. She says that if he does, she will spare his life. Van glances at her and remarks that she is obsessively fixated on the idea of status. Karina replies that such thinking is only natural, declaring that magical strength is determined by bloodline and that this belief forms the very foundation of the kingdom. Van lets out a short, bitter laugh and says that it is the most predictable noble answer imaginable. Van steps forward and challenges her directly, asking whether she truly believes that acting noble will make her one. Karina falls silent for a brief moment, then demands to know what he just said. Van responds that he knows the truth, stating plainly that she is half commoner. He presses further, saying that this is why she clings so desperately to becoming a true noble, hoping her father will finally acknowledge her. Karina's face contorts as something inside her snaps, rage surging through her body. She begins to shout his name in fury, her voice shaking as she struggles to contain herself. Violent mana floods the arena. Students stare in confusion, asking what the two of them are even talking about. Helene continues watching intently, realizing that Van is deliberately provoking Karina, trying to draw out a strike with no restraint whatsoever. Ralph panics and cries out, asking why Van would do something so reckless. Falk realizes with dread that Van is preparing to use that technique. Inside Karina's mind, her buried truth rises like poison. She admits to herself that she is a foreign existence within noble society. She recognizes that this is why, despite Van being a Garuda, she felt sympathy toward him. She recalls that this is why she volunteered to test him, intending to resolve things without killing him. Her expression hardens as she concludes that he does not appreciate that mercy. Her eyes blaze as she declares that if even he dares to insult her, then he should come. Her mana erupts, lightning crawling along the blade as she screams that she will kill him as he wishes. Van lowers his stance, charges straight into the storm, and answers that yes, he is coming. Karina gathers a raging violet glow around her sword and descends from above, unleashing the Heavenfall blade. The strike falls like a guillotine, and her eyes widen in shock when Van steps directly into it instead of retreating. The spectators erupt in panic. One exclaims that this is sword snatch disarming with bare hands and insists that such a technique should never work in real combat. Van inwardly agrees, stating that stopping a descending blade with one's hands is realistically impossible, then clarifies what he actually did. The explanation states that Van first matched the relative speed of his hands to the blade as closely as possible. From the moment of contact, he began breaking, and in the infinitesimal instant before the sword completed its arc, he dispersed and absorbed the force. The technique is identified as Stillgrip, the zero-style grasp, the same method that brought all of Helene's ice spears crashing down before. He comments that the Heavenfall blade is an overwhelming technique, but its sheer power is what doomed it. Karina blurts out that such a thing is impossible as Van twists through the remaining force and turns the clash against her. A violent shockwave ripples through the arena as Van's counterattack sends Karina flying. She crashes to the ground and collapses to one knee with a pained groan. Students stare in disbelief. One whispers that the thousand-blade sword princess has been brought to her knees. Another asks if this is truly the power of that Garuda. A purple-haired girl stammers Karina's name, while Van's two friends shout for Van not to let his guard down and to press the attack. Van does not push for a finishing strike. Karina, breathing hard, demands to know why he is not ending it and asks whether he is trying to show her mercy. Van answers that he is not doing anything like that, and he adds that he has no interest in bullying some half-finished noble lady. He then tells her that she still has not revealed everything she is capable of. He urges her to come on and insists that he wants to see the real Karina. Karina glares at him, calls his words presumptuous, and turns toward the looming violet gate of the sword coffin behind her. Spiraling magic circles fill the air as she reaches into the coffin's radiance and pulls something out. The eighth prince whispers that she actually drew it. His companion murmurs that this is her first time seeing the real thing and questions whether she is being serious. Around him, students recognize the weapon by reputation, Ralph beginning to name it aloud while Falk admits that even without being a swordsman, he has heard of it. Helene confirms their reaction, stating that they are right to be alarmed. She explains that it is one of the most famous swords in the country, the Sword Saint's signature blade, Sternkreis the Star Ring Sword. She describes it as a spring sword forged from extremely thin, flexible special metal. Van studies the weapon and remembers that in his previous life it was known by another name, the Massacre Sword, Blood Chain. Karina lifts her gaze and declares that she will show him. She says that she will show him what she has sacrificed to stand where she is. Van answers that he understands, and he says that he will witness all of it as he faces her in the coffin, like Arsenal looming behind her. Crimson lightning gathers around Karina's blade as she declares that this is her full power. She challenges him to endure it if he believes he can. A violent red spiral blooms and grinds across the arena, and spectators recoil as pressure swells over the stone. Van realizes that this may be the consequence of his own overconfidence. Helene identifies the technique as Circle Requiem, a national magic art. She explains that it is an ultimate technique only a handful within House Luthier can reach. She adds that it uses magic to amplify the spring sword's flexibility, driving the tip to supersonic speed. Karina announces that the dance of the circle spares no one inside its domain. She states that whether it is flame or lightning, it slices everything down all the same. She warns that the field will soon expand until it blankets the entire arena, and she offers him a choice: if he admits defeat and flees, she will let him live. Then she coldly adds that if he stays, there will not even be bones left. Van replies that there is no need for her to waste time expanding anything. He says that he will come to her instead. He steps into the raging current and observes that it is fast, but he concludes that it is not truly invisible. He names the state he is entering as tachypsychia. He explains that it is a phenomenon where the brain's processing speed accelerates drastically under extreme stress. He describes it as a survival mechanism that helps humans find the best path through an overwhelming flood of information. He adds that most people only experience it by accident, but he has mastered the ability to trigger it intentionally. With his eyes sharpening, he tells himself to move, and he bursts into the circle. A sudden clash sends a shock through the stands. The eighth prince mutters in disbelief that Van deflected it. Heinz observes that Van is only parrying the sword's tip. Van focuses through the storm and explains to himself that the spring sword's center of gravity always remains at the tip. He warns himself not to be fooled by its complex trajectory as he continues reading the blade's murderous path and intercepting it. He locks his gaze on the crimson slashes and decides that all he needs is to strike the tip down over and over. He lunges into the storm, drives his hand into the blade's line, and knocks the sword point off course. Karina staggers on her circle and blurts out that he is a monster too. Van denies it, stating that he has only worked harder than most, just as she has. Karina bristles, demanding to know what he means by that. Van states that the spring sword chooses its wielder, and that anyone without true mastery would be cut apart by their own blade. He adds that being born into a swordsman's bloodline is not enough to reach this level. Then he presses her, shouting to ask how many years she has poured into that single sword. Karina freezes. She realizes she has never once stopped to count. A memory rises. She remembers that her father taught her to hold a sword only once, just once. She thinks that it may have been a whim, but she remembers how, in that moment, she truly felt a bond between them. After that, it never happened again. Busy with state affairs, her father had no time for a bastard daughter. She tells herself that she decided to perfect the sword anyway, believing that if she became stronger than everyone else, then surely her father and the house would acknowledge her. She recalls day after day of hellish training and admits that she became too strong. She remembers how the scornful looks disappeared, but she also remembers what replaced them: constant fear and hatred. And she remembers that the warmth in her father's eyes vanished. Her eyes burn as she remembers the day her father recognized her as a legitimate heir, a daughter born of a mistress. And she thinks that it must have been the most he could force himself to do. For the sake of family peace, she tells herself that he restrained the true-born children and soothed their mother, and that turning away from her was the correct choice. In that realization, she understands that the only thing she had left was the sword. In her mind, she stands before a throne and believes that her existence would allow no denial. She vows that she will prove her worth with undeniable might, because she thinks that is the only path to recognition. Back in the arena, rage floods her face. She screams at Van and demands what he could possibly know about any of that. Crimson light detonates around her as she flips through the air and brings her blade down in a savage cascade. A storm of slashes tears through the space in blinding flashes. Van is hurled backward by the pressure. He grits his teeth, eyes wide, a strangled sound caught in his throat as he stares up at the incoming cuts. The edge opens his skin as he twists and braces, forcing himself upright while red lightning rakes the floor and walls around him. Karina's eye tightens as she watches him endure, and for the briefest moment her expression wavers. Students recoil at the sidelines. Ralph blurts out that Van is still advancing. Fox stares in disbelief and says that he is pushing forward through the storm of slashes. Karina turns her head panting, and shouts that she cannot understand why he is going this far. She insists that everyone else has always fled before her sword, and she demands to know why a man without magic still refuses to back down. Van keeps moving. His shoulders remain squared as red arcs crawl over his uniform. In his mind, he first tells himself that it is to prevent a future rebellion, then immediately corrects that thought, realizing it is not only that. He remembers a desperate homeland exploited by evil and left with nothing. He thinks that suffering is something he understands better than anyone. He fixes his gaze on Karina and recognizes that someone is crying at the center of this storm, and he cannot bring himself to abandon them. Karina swings again, her voice cracking as she insists that she is not crying. Van answers without slowing, stating that she is. He tells her that her sword is screaming in her place. He presses further, asking whether this is still not enough, because it is shouting. The words hit her like a strike. Her lips tremble and a sharp, voiceless reaction catches in her throat. Karina bares her teeth, fury and shame twisting together. She spits that he has no right to act as if he understands her. Then she screams that this sword is all she has. She declares that she became stronger than anyone with it, and she vows that she will make the entire house bow. The red field surges harder as she lowers her stance and drags power into her next strike. Van raises his arms against the pressure and forces his breathing steady. Blood and sweat run down his cheek. He pushes his voice out and admits that he does not know everything. Then he tells her to listen, calling her Karina, and says that her worth is not decided by anyone else. He steps forward, boots grinding over cracked stone, and adds that the sweat and tears she shed unseen matter. He insists that the weight of every swing that felt like carving away her soul cannot be denied. He declares that no one can deny that value. Karina freezes for a fraction of a second, eyes widening as if something deeper than flesh has been struck. Van continues fierce and honest, saying that even if no one acknowledges it, to him she is the finest magic swordsman he has seen. The violent glow around Karina falters, her grip tightens as her breath catches. A memory flickers at the edge of her mind, warm light, a smaller hand guided into position, and a voice close beside her. In that distant scene, her father calls her Karina and tells her to listen well. In the warmth of that memory, her father tells her that even when cutting down enemies, she must never swing her sword in anger or hatred. He tells her to be noble. He says that even in battle, pride must remain in her heart. As he places his hand over hers on the hilt, he tells her that this is the sword of House Luthier. The present snaps back. Wind and dust roll across shattered stone as Karina and Van face each other at close range. Karina steadies her breathing and realizes that this is what her father was trying to teach her. She thinks about pride and decides it was never meant to be begged from others. It is something she must carry herself to remain who she is. Tears stream down her cheeks. She admits to herself that she finally understands. She realizes she threw it away on her own, the lesson her father gave her. With shoulders squared and eyes no longer trembling, she tells Van Kruger that she is grateful. She says that he helped her remember. She says that he brought her back to the sword she truly wanted to wield. Pink light licks along her blade, swelling into a fierce, crackling aura. Karina tightens her grip until her knuckles pale, and declares that this time she will pour everything into this technique. She asks whether he can receive it. Van meets her gaze without flinching, lowers his center of gravity, and answers that he will gladly take it. Karina releases a sharp cry and steps in. The slash is an overhead cut, simple in form, yet refined to its absolute peak. It is the only technique her father ever taught her. She drives it down with everything she has left, carving a blazing line through the air, as if splitting the arena itself. Van's lips curl as he watches the descending death line and states that this is the real Karina. The impact erupts into a violent surge of wind and light. The gale whips Karina's twin tails as the slash roars past. Van moves through the chaos with unreal precision, slipping through the narrowest gap and delivering his strike. They stand frozen for a moment, then a beat later, Karina's knees give out, strength drains from her arms, and she drops face down onto the broken floor, breath ragged. She admits that it is complete defeat. Even so, she turns her head enough to speak and tells Van that she is thankful. Van approaches and offers his hand, saying that the feeling is mutual. He adds that her sword was magnificent. He speaks her name Karina with no mockery, only clear acknowledgement. Around them, students remain frozen. Someone mutters that a 5 crown has been defeated. Another adds stunned that it was by a first year and worse by a Garuda. For a moment, silence hangs under the blue sky. Then Heinz begins to clap, slow and deliberate. The sound carries, one by one. More hands join in until applause spreads row after row, becoming a wave. Van pulls Karina up, and they clasp hands in the center of the ruined arena while cheers and clapping rise around them. The morning after his legendary showdown, Van is already back on his feet. Anyone who sees him would struggle to believe he had spent the previous afternoon fighting as if he had been tossed into a magical blender. He stands comfortably beside his 2 loyal companions, Ralph and Falk, while they hover around him with the eager energy of excited dogs that have just discovered a tennis ball. To reassure them, he casually flexes his arm and explains that the Academy's healers had done their work flawlessly. He states that their magic had erased every injury, leaving him without even a small scratch. Falk can barely contain himself. He declares with shining eyes that the duel from the day before will become one of the Academy's most legendary moments. He insists that future students will whisper about it for years. Van, however, shrugs off the praise and claims that it had been nothing more than an ordinary duel. His friends immediately protest. They argue that a first-year student defeating one of the 5 brilliant crowns cannot possibly be considered ordinary. From their perspective, The event feels less like a duel and more like a glitch in reality itself. Their enthusiastic admiration suddenly stops when Falk notices something nearby. Under a tree stands a girl with unmistakable pink hair. The sight instantly catches their attention. It is none other than the Thousand Bladesword Princess herself. Despite having been defeated in front of the entire academy the previous day, she appears surprisingly healthy and composed. Ralph and Falk react with immediate alarm. They whisper nervously that she might have come back to challenge him again and settle the score. Van, however, shows no such concern. He simply greets her casually, as though meeting an old acquaintance at the training grounds. The princess walks toward him with a stern expression, her face carrying the seriousness of someone conducting an inspection. She immediately criticizes him, stating that he had been late in offering proper greetings, and that his attitude lacked the respect expected within the academy. When he jokingly wonders aloud whether she intends to punish him again, she suddenly makes an announcement that shocks everyone present. Her cheeks turn red, almost like a ripe tomato, and she points directly at him. With firm determination, she declares that she has decided to appoint him as her knight. The declaration creates a moment of heavy confusion. Within the academy, the squire system is meant to allow upperclassmen to mentor younger students. Officially, the senior student becomes a guide and supervisor for the junior. In practice, however, the princess is essentially announcing that she intends to keep a constant eye on him from now on, so that she can personally correct what she believes to be his unacceptable behavior. Van quickly realizes what this means. To him, the arrangement sounds suspiciously like being placed under constant surveillance. The thought clearly unsettles him, and his expression resembles that of a computer frozen during an update at 99%. While he silently panics at the idea of losing his privacy, Ralph and Falk whisper excitedly among themselves. They argue that the situation might actually be a blessing. In their view, if the powerful sword princess claims him as her squire, then no other student in the academy would dare cause him trouble. The princess continues with unwavering confidence. She states that he should feel deeply honored to receive such recognition from her, and insists that he immediately swear loyalty and accept the position. Van listens carefully, but freedom matters more to him than any prestigious title. He politely refuses the offer. Without hesitation, he then activates what might be called his secret technique, running away as fast as possible. As he bolts toward the horizon, he loudly declares that he refuses to live under anyone's constant supervision, leaving the princess standing there in stunned disbelief. Her shock lasts only a moment. Determined not to let him escape so easily, she immediately begins chasing after him. As she sprints across the academy grounds, she shouts that he cannot simply run away from her guidance. Watching the chase unfold, Ralph and Falk begin to exchange suspicious glances. They quietly speculate that the princess's persistence might not be motivated solely by training or discipline. One of them suggests that she may actually have developed a strong crush on Van, who managed to defeat her. While this chaotic pursuit unfolds outside, the atmosphere inside the meeting room of the Five Brilliant Crowns is far more tense. Prince Leonis sits at the table, visibly trembling with anger. He declares that the outcome of the duel is unacceptable. In his eyes, the fact that someone from what he considers a slave race defeated a noble is not merely embarrassing. He insists that it represents a serious threat to the entire structure of their society. Leonis explains that the kingdom's hierarchy is supposedly built upon magical power. If someone without even a trace of mana can defeat a noble who possesses great magical strength, then the royal family's claim to authority begins to look fragile. In a burst of frustration, he slams his fist against the table. He accuses the Ice Flower Lady of deliberately trying to weaken the nobility by allowing Van to enroll at the academy in the first place. Nearby, the purple-haired student who always wears sunglasses indoors calmly wonders aloud how a random newcomer could possess such refined combat techniques. He remarks that Van fights with the skill of a trained assassin. However, Amelia, the red-haired elite among the crowns, does not appear concerned. She calmly drinks her tea with the composed elegance of someone who considers everyone else beneath her. She explains that Van's abilities are not truly threatening to genuine nobles. According to her reasoning, a true noble leader serves as both shield and hammer, someone capable of protecting the people while crushing entire armies of monsters. In contrast, she dismisses Van as nothing more than a skilled street fighter. She continues by stating that his fighting style may be useful for assassinations, but would be meaningless on a real battlefield. In her opinion, he could never replace the nobles who serve as the pillars of the nation. To demonstrate the limits of his abilities, she proposes using the upcoming Legion training exercise. The Legion training is a practical combat exercise in which students form military-style units and hunt dangerous magical beasts. Amelia explains that she intends to place Van in her squad specifically so she can expose his weaknesses in front of everyone. At that moment, the atmosphere shifts when Prince Heinz enters the room. The blonde prince strolls in with an easy confidence, as if he is posing for a portrait rather than stepping into a restricted meeting for elite students. Even though the room is meant only for the highest-ranking members, he smiles casually and asks whether he and his companions might join Amelia's unit during the Legion training. He claims that her earlier speech about noble conviction had deeply inspired him. He describes her words as if they had delivered a powerful revelation. Amelia appears delighted by the prince's attention. Flattered by his admiration, she accepts the request and states that she will personally educate the troublesome boy while the prince observes. Heinz simply stands there smiling, his expression suggesting a man who specializes in betrayal. Behind that pleasant grin, it is clear that he is planning something complicated and likely filled with chaos. Meanwhile, back on the academy grounds, the energetic chase eventually ends. The pink-haired princess finally manages to catch her target. Not long afterward, the scene shifts to a peaceful tea gathering hosted by the Ice Flower Lady. Van sits comfortably at the table, focused entirely on eating a biscuit with the dedication of a squirrel preparing supplies for winter. Nearby, his two noble companions, Ralph and Falk, listen attentively as the details of the upcoming Legion training are explained. Falk begins by clarifying that the exercise will not simply involve students pretending to fight. He explains that the participants will actually command real soldiers from the kingdom during the operation. Van pauses his eating long enough to confirm his understanding. He states that this sounds very much like an internship designed to train future commanders. Helen nods in agreement and confirms his interpretation. She then reveals the final detail. The operation will take place in the Lament Wetlands, a dangerous magical wasteland whose gloomy name suggests a place far from pleasant. The Lament Wetlands are a land saturated with dense magical energy, far more dangerous than the forest used during the Academy's entrance exam. Helen explains that the environment is thick with unstable mana, creating the perfect habitat for dangerous magical beasts. She states that these creatures thrive in the wetlands, and when their numbers grow too large, they begin migrating outward. Those migrations eventually turn into violent stampedes capable of crushing towns and entire regions of civilization. Because of that constant threat, she explains that the nobility carries an important responsibility. She says that noble forces regularly enter the wetlands to thin the population of monsters before those migrations grow out of control. According to her explanation, this preventive hunting is necessary to stop disasters before they begin. Van listens while calmly destroying another snack. He nods and tells her to continue explaining the details while he finishes chewing. Helen continues by outlining how the Legion training is organized. She explains that first-year students will each lead small squads. Above them, the upperclassmen organize those squads into larger military units called companies. Ralph raises the question that clearly sits in everyone's mind. He asks whether performing well during the Legion training could lead to fame and recognition. Helen confirms that this is exactly how many students build their reputation. She explains that every one of the current 5 brilliant crowns first gained recognition during their own first-year Legion training. However, she then reveals an important detail that complicates things. She explains that upperclassmen commanders personally nominate the students they want in their companies. Van immediately assumes that this system will not work in his favor. He silently imagines himself being chosen last, like a kid avoided during gym class because of a contagious rash. In his mind, someone like him, a Galda with no magic, would naturally end up among the leftover picks. Helen quickly corrects that assumption. She explains that many senior students are actually interested in recruiting him. Van looks completely puzzled by that statement, so his two companions step in to clarify the obvious. They explain that he is the student who defeated the Sword Princess and killed a demon during the entrance exam. To the rest of the academy, he has become something of a legend. They describe him as a mysterious fighter who defeats powerful opponents without using even a single drop of magic. Van stands there speechless. In his previous life, people had treated him like background furniture that barely existed. Now he has somehow become the popular figure everyone wants on their team. He begins to realize that the world around him is slowly changing. At the same time, he senses that not everyone welcomes his sudden rise. A sharp instinct warns him that someone is watching. He lifts his eyes toward the distance and immediately locks eyes with Prince Leonis, who stands on a balcony overlooking the courtyard. Leonis is visibly startled. He cannot believe Van managed to sense his presence despite the prince using no magical detection. Even so, Leonis quickly hides his surprise. He grits his teeth and mutters that Van and his companions should enjoy their friendly games while they still can. Back at the table, Helen proposes a way to remove the uncertainty surrounding the draft. She explains that, as one of the crowns, she has the authority to prioritize her selections. She states that she intends to draft Van, Ralph, and Falk directly into her own unit. The two noble companions immediately celebrate the idea of joining a powerful squad. However, their excitement does not last long. A familiar voice suddenly interrupts them. The Sword Princess appears beside the table with the determined presence of someone preparing to file a legal claim. She firmly declares that supervising Vine is her responsibility because he is her squire. Because of that, she insists that he will naturally be assigned to her command. Van immediately protests. He loudly explains that he had already rejected the squire offer earlier. Unfortunately, no one seems to care about his objections. Helen laughs lightly and remarks that the princess's idea also sounds interesting. She speaks as if the situation is amusing, completely ignoring Van's desperate attempt to defend his personal freedom. Several days later, the academy courtyard becomes crowded as students gather around the large bulletin board displaying the official Legion assignments. The crowd is massive. Falk comments that being personally nominated by a respected upperclassman is considered a huge honor. The group searches through the posted lists, fully expecting to find themselves assigned to Helen's company. Then Van suddenly freezes. His name is not listed there. He checks again carefully, scanning every name. Still nothing. Next he searches through the roster for the Sword Princess's company. His name is not there either. A heavy feeling begins forming in his stomach. Slowly, he raises a finger and points toward the list for the 5th company. Ralph and Falk read the heading and immediately turn pale. They ask in disbelief whether the situation is some kind of cruel joke. The commander of the 5th company is Amelia Rosenwald, the red-haired elite who openly believes commoners belong beneath nobles. Then Falk notices something even worse. He points to the name written directly beside Van's. It is Prince Heinz. Van stares at the board in disbelief. He realizes he has been assigned to the same company as the traitor responsible for his death in his previous life, as well as the noblewoman who clearly despises him. It feels like a nightmare arranged specifically for him. Almost as if summoned by the tension itself, Prince Heinz arrives at the scene alongside Amelia. The blonde prince walks forward with a pleasant smile that resembles a shark spotting injured prey. He comments cheerfully that this must be quite the coincidence. Van turns toward him with an expression that suggests he has just swallowed an entire lemon. Prince Heinz and Amelia approach with the polite but unsettling energy of corporate representatives about to deliver unpleasant news. Heinz displays an overly bright smile, behaving as though the entrance exam, where he had already committed murder once before, had simply been a fun opportunity for bonding. He extends his hand and says that they should work together and give their best effort during the training. Van does not reciprocate the enthusiasm. He stares at the offered hand as if it were an untrustworthy piece of trash. He gives a short and dry acknowledgement without making any attempt to shake it. Amelia Rosenwald then formally introduces herself as one of the 5 brilliant crowns. Van bows politely and apologizes for arriving late to the gathering. Amelia dismisses the apology with a casual wave. She claims that she dislikes stiff formalities. However, she immediately follows that statement by reminding him that he should remember his place as a mere Galda. In her view, his role in the company is extremely simple. She states that his responsibility is to stay out of the way and follow her instructions obediently, acting as nothing more than a scout. Before the conversation can grow any more hostile, Helen steps forward. The woman who personally brought Van into the academy asks Amelia whether she might be treating him a little too harshly. Amelia refuses to retreat from her stance. She calmly explains that her attitude is actually a form of kindness. She sincerely believes that individuals without magic are dangerous liabilities who could endanger the entire squad during combat. Because of that belief, she states that she is generously assigning Van to sentry duty. As he listens to her reasoning, Van realizes that Amelia represents the most frustrating type of opponent. There is no malice in her eyes. She is not insulting him out of cruelty or amusement. She truly believes that her judgment is correct. Van calmly explains that every role within a unit has value. He states that this understanding is precisely why he chose to enroll in the academy. He remembers Helen once telling him that magic is not the only path to the top. With that thought in mind, he tells Amelia that she should keep watching him closely with those elitist eyes of hers. He declares that he intends to prove that he is far from useless. Amelia shows no interest in continuing the discussion. She simply turns her back and walks away. Prince Heinz follows after her like an obedient companion. Before leaving completely, Heinz pauses long enough to offer a friendly reassurance. He tells Van not to worry and claims that his abilities will surely prove useful eventually. However, the tone of his voice carries the unsettling implication that he might already be planning a funeral. As the pair depart, 2 figures watch quietly from the side. The pink-haired sword princess studies the situation carefully. She suspects that the prince is once again plotting something behind the scenes. Beside her, Helen also reaches a troubling conclusion. She realizes that Heinz must have used considerable influence within the academy to manipulate the company assignments. While the 2 women worry about the political maneuvering, Van stands silently. His mind drifts back to memories from his previous life. He clearly remembers what happened the last time soldiers were sent to the Lament wetlands. The mission had turned into a catastrophe. A completely new species of monster had appeared during the operation, overwhelming the forces sent there. Almost everyone had died. The disaster had become a historical tragedy, a complete wipeout that eventually ignited a devastating civil war. Rolf and Falk approach Van soon after the assignment announcement, both clearly concerned about his mental state. They check on him carefully, expecting frustration or anger. Van, however, barely seems to hear them. His attention is fixed somewhere else entirely. Instead of worrying about pride or reputation, he is quietly calculating survival probabilities in his head. He quickly realizes that the careful plan he had formed earlier has collapsed. His strategy had been simple: stay close to the strongest fighters and avoid unnecessary attention. Now that approach is no longer possible. If the mysterious new monster from his previous life appears again, hiding behind powerful allies will not save anyone. Van glances at his two loyal companions and immediately understands the problem. Ralph and Falk, with their eager and optimistic personalities, would not survive such a disaster without serious injuries. They simply are not prepared for what is coming. To make matters worse, Van now finds himself placed in a company where he is treated more like hired help than a commander. Meanwhile, the true danger approaching the Lament wetlands is something far beyond what the Academy expects. When the time finally comes for the army to depart, Amelia steps forward to address the assembled soldiers. She delivers a grand speech filled with declarations about noble pride, duty, and the honor of serving the kingdom. Her words ignite the crowd, and the soldiers respond with loud cheers and powerful enthusiasm. Unfortunately, the men assigned to Van's squad react very differently. Rather than feeling inspired, they begin openly complaining among themselves. They do not even bother lowering their voices. Several of them mock the idea that they must follow a leader who carries no weapon and possesses no magic. One soldier complains that serving under a Galda with empty hands makes the entire mission feel like a joke. Another says that they have essentially been assigned to a disposable unit before the battle has even started. Van listens quietly for a while as the insults continue. Eventually, he decides that the commentary has gone on long enough. He steps forward and calmly informs the soldiers that he is now their commanding officer. He says that the time for pointless chatter is over. He states firmly that they should close their mouths and focus on the mission like soldiers who actually deserve to serve in the kingdom's army. The soldiers fall silent, though several of them still attempt to maintain smug expressions. From a distance, Amelia observes the situation carefully. To her, the scene only confirms her expectations. She believes the group assigned to Van consists entirely of the worst soldiers available, individuals with no future in the military and no chance for promotion. In her mind, the fact that Van received such a hopeless squad proves that he has already reached the limit of his abilities as a commander. Without hesitation, Amelia gives the order for the army to begin marching. Her command is loud and confident, and the surrounding troops respond with another wave of cheers. Van's squad, however, does not join the enthusiasm. His soldiers remain completely silent, carrying themselves with the same excitement one might expect from people walking into a tax inspection. As the army travels deeper into the forest, Amelia eventually calls for a short rest. The moment the break begins, Prince Heinz immediately begins performing his usual charming routine. He walks through the camp speaking to soldiers from various squads. He politely reminds them to drink water and remain alert, presenting himself as a model of royal responsibility. His behavior resembles that of a perfectly trained camp counselor guiding a group of eager campers. Elsewhere, other squad leaders inspect their equipment and speak with their soldiers to maintain morale. Van's squad looks very different. His soldiers sit together in miserable silence, surrounded by frustration and resentment. Several of them begin complaining again. One soldier remarks bitterly that they are forced to walk on foot, while their captain comfortably observes everything from horseback. Another says that their leader clearly has nothing useful to contribute. Eventually, one of the soldiers loudly demands to know whether their captain intends to say anything in his defense. Van calmly responds that he has noticed they all have many complaints to share. He explains that he is willing to listen to them once before the mission continues. That invitation opens the floodgates. The soldiers begin shouting about their equipment, claiming that their weapons and armor are outdated junk. One man angrily declares that their leader is nothing more than a useless magical outcast. Another soldier says that the academy must be using their squad as expendable shields to protect the noble students. He admits that he is already worried about whether he will survive the mission at all. Van quietly listens to everything, then he climbs down from his horse. He tells the squad that he understands their anxiety. However, he also explains that they are completely mistaken about how things are going to unfold. Van quickly realizes that reasoning with them will not change anything. Instead, he decides to demonstrate his point directly. He calmly invites the entire squad to attack him all at once. The soldiers stare at him in total confusion. One particularly irritated soldier finally snaps and charges forward. He swings his sword aggressively, clearly intending to run his captain through. Van reacts instantly. He catches the blade with his bare hands as casually as someone catching a falling leaf. The attacking soldier freezes in disbelief, struggling to understand how his captain's hands appear to be stronger than steel. Van gently pulls the sword away and pushes the soldier to the ground. Then he turns toward the rest of the squad and calmly asks whether anyone else would like to try. No one moves. Most of them appear as if their souls have temporarily left their bodies. To make his point absolutely clear, Van takes the worn sword and walks toward a nearby tree. With a single relaxed swing, he slices through the trunk. The blade passes through the wood effortlessly, turning the tree into neatly split firewood. The reaction is immediate. The soldiers stare at him in stunned silence. Even members of nearby squads begin watching with expressions usually reserved for famous performers. Van returns the sword to its owner. He casually remarks that the weapon may be somewhat old but still works perfectly well. He then explains that his current fighting style was not chosen out of laziness. He says that he mastered every weapon he could find before eventually deciding that fighting empty-handed suited him best. Van finishes by assuring the squad that he has no intention of letting them die useless deaths. He adds that the only way they would end up as monster food is if they foolishly wander off and get themselves killed. From the top of a nearby hill, Amelia observes the entire scene. Her expression remains cold and critical. In her mind, Van's display proves that he is still an amateur leader. She believes he is ruling his squad through fear rather than respect. Amelia concludes that soldiers bound together by intimidation will eventually betray their commander the moment a real crisis appears. As far as she is concerned, Van has already failed as a leader. Night eventually falls as the army reaches the outer edge of the Lament wetlands. The soldiers establish a camp along the swamp's border. Amelia and sit together studying maps under lantern light while discussing the next stage of the mission. Prince Heinz relaxes nearby with a book, appearing completely at ease. Meanwhile, Van's squad gathers around a small fire. Several soldiers quietly wonder whether their captain has finally realized how dangerous the mission truly is. One of them jokes that Van might have already abandoned them and escaped into the night. Another soldier laughs bitterly and says that their entire squad consists of disposable misfits anyway. He remarks that having a Galda as their leader is actually a fitting arrangement for a group of rejects. At that exact moment, Van suddenly emerges from the darkness behind them. His appearance is so quiet that several soldiers nearly jump out of their seats. Van calmly asks them to explain what they meant about being outcasts. The soldiers freeze mid-conversation. Van walks over and sits down beside the fire. However, he has not returned empty-handed. Without saying a word, he drops several freshly caught rabbits and a bundle of wild mushrooms onto the ground. The squad stares at the unexpected feast with wide eyes, their shock so intense that it almost looks as if their eyeballs might begin sweating. Around the campfire, a pot of stew boiled over the flames while meat roasted on skewers. Van waited until it was done, then told the men that it was time. As they stared at him in wary silence, he handed out bowls and told them to eat, adding that barely filling their stomachs would never give them enough strength for tomorrow's battle. He then held out a bundle of herbs and told them to tuck them into their boots and rub them against the inside, explaining that they worked on blisters. One soldier blinked in confusion and asked what had gotten into him all of a sudden, then accused him of trying to win them over with food. Van lowered his gaze and said that he knew what it meant to march until his feet were covered in blisters. He said that he knew what it was like to be issued rock, hard bread as rations, and that when luck turned bad, that food would wreck a man's stomach and leave him half dead before the battle even began. The soldiers fell silent. One of them muttered that it was hard to believe someone his age had already seen the battlefield. Another remarked that Van was Galda and said that, if so, it would not be surprising if he had lived through that. Their captain cut in and asked whether Van was pitying them because he used to be stuck in the same miserable place. Van answered that it was not pity. He said that it was an investment. In his heart, he admitted that it was for his own goals. He thought that he would use them as pieces on the board and checkmate his enemies. But he also promised that he would never use them as expendable pawns. He declared that he would bring every one of them back alive. Then he held out the bowl again and told them that, if they wanted to survive for now, they should become his pieces. He assured them that they would not regret it. The men stared at him in stunned silence. After a pause, one soldier let out a rough laugh and repeated Van's words about becoming his pieces, asking whether that was supposed to be funny. Van replied that he did not know. The man smirked and said that he had never seen a Galda brag that big before. Another soldier asked whether they were really supposed to trust this captain. Someone answered by asking whether they had any better option. As they finally began to eat, one of them added that, besides, Van was strong and he could cook. He said that Van might already be more reliable than some fancy noble. Van watched them quietly and reflected that he had learned this lesson the hard way in his previous life. Rank and file soldiers were not like nobles. Their lives could not be wagered on lofty ideals about the country or the people. What they wanted most was simple. They wanted to return alive to the families waiting for them at home. That was their greatest and only goal. That was why Van thought. He never preached noble ideals to men like them. Only overwhelming strength and the real promise of staying alive could truly earn their trust. In the forest camp, soldiers hurried to tear down the tents while the morning light filtered through the trees. Amelia ordered them to finish breaking camp and stand by for her signal, and the men answered at once that they understood. A little later, the troops reported that the camp had been fully dismantled and that they were ready to move at any time. Van gave a calm smile and told them that they had done well. He ordered them to hold position until new instructions, stay alert and keep watch. The men answered sharply, and as Van walked off with them following his lead, Amelia watched in surprise. She thought that he had whipped that pack of misfit thugs into shape in a single night. Prince Heinz approached from behind and quietly observed that Van truly seemed to possess the qualities of a commander. The commander agreed only in part and said that his real worth would be proven on the battlefield. Soon after, she summoned all squad leaders before her and declared that she would now issue the operation orders. The officers gathered around a large map spread out in the clearing. She explained that beyond the forest lay their target area, the Lament wetlands. She said that most of the wetlands were inhabited by gremlings, with swamps scattered throughout the region. She continued by explaining that visibility across the area was generally good, but the entire region was a magical wasteland. Because of that, she warned them to assume that every patch of grass might conceal a beast. Then she moved on to the plan itself. She explained that, as the Legion Vanguard, their role was to confirm enemy presence inside the wetlands. Their unit, she said, would form a wedge formation and charge straight through the area. That announcement shocked the gathered soldiers. Some exclaimed that they were being sent directly into enemy territory. Prince Heinz calmly remarked that this was a forceful reconnaissance. The commander confirmed that he was correct. The plan was then laid out in full. A forceful reconnaissance, she explained, meant deliberately entering enemy territory and measuring the enemy's strength by the intensity of their response. She admitted that it was dangerous, but said that it was the fastest way to grasp the scale of the enemy. Fortunately, she added, the ground in the Lament wetlands was relatively firm, so horses could pass through. If they avoided the scattered marshes and streams, she said, breaking through the area in one sweep would not be difficult. After finishing her explanation, she asked whether anyone had questions. Van raised his hand. He asked why they were using forceful reconnaissance instead of standard scouting. The commander answered without hesitation. She explained that the wetlands were vast and full of places where monsters could hide. Small, careful scouting parties, she said, could not reveal their true numbers. That was why they would push in at full strength and shake the enemy into revealing itself. By forcing a response, she said, they could gather solid information without wasting time. She concluded that this was the true strength of forceful reconnaissance. One of the officers immediately praised her reasoning. He said that the plan was bold yet highly logical, just as expected from the heir of House Rodenwald, the guardians of the kingdom's border. She cut him off coldly. She said that she did not need praise. Instead, she told them not to limit themselves to obedience alone, but to show their own thoughts as well. She reminded them that this operation was also a training ground, so there was no need for anyone to hold back. The group fell silent at her rebuke. Then Van stepped forward and challenged the plan. He said that, rather than conducting a forceful reconnaissance, they should send a small group of scouts instead. Van stepped forward and said that, instead of a forceful reconnaissance, they should send in a small number of scouts. Standing over the map, he explained that the swamp offered too much open visibility. He said that if the whole unit advanced before locating the monsters would notice them first. Amelia answered that he was correct, and said that this was exactly why they were using forceful reconnaissance. Van replied that, if the enemy landed the first strike, there was a chance their unit could be wiped out. Her eyes sharpened at once, and she asked whether he truly thought she would fall behind mere monsters. Van remained calm and said that, because he was responsible for the lives of his subordinates, it was only natural for him to assume the worst possible outcome. The commander fell silent for a moment, then said that even if such a possibility were exceedingly small, she understood his concern. She asked what he thought they should do instead. Van answered immediately that his unit should move ahead first and draw out the enemy's attack. He said that if the main force advanced only after confirming that attack, the risk of being caught off guard would be reduced. She looked at him and said that she would praise his courage for speaking his mind, adding that this was the proper attitude for a future officer candidate. For an instant, Van wondered whether she might actually accept his proposal. Then her tone turned cold. She said that, as a tactic, it was too cowardly. She explained that, with such a method, the scouting would not even be finished before the Legion's main force arrived. When Van tried to protest, she continued that if their presence were detected, it would only give the enemy time to prepare. She warned that such hesitation could strangle them instead. Extending her hand like a blade, she declared that the most effective tactic was to strike the enemy before its preparations were complete. Van thought that she was correct, at least under normal circumstances. But he also knew that this operation would fail. He tried again and said that they were only a temporary training unit, and that their ability to respond to unknown threats was limited. The commander cut him off and demanded concrete evidence. She asked what threat he was even talking about, whether it was enemy numbers or a terrain trap, and ordered him to prove it. Van clenched his teeth. Inwardly, he admitted that he did not know that much for certain. In his previous life, he had only been a Galda mercenary, and at that time he had been stationed far away on the western border. He recalled that the information about the monsters that appeared in the Swamp of Lament had been sealed by the Kingdom Army and erased from the official records. He suspected that Heinz probably knew something, but back then it had never been a matter that involved him. The commander said that concerns without evidence were nothing more than cowardice, and that such words only dragged down the soldiers' morale for no reason. When Van tried to speak again, she cut him off sharply and ordered him to stop. She declared that she allowed suggestions, but that any further objections would be treated as disobedience. Then she ordered Van Kruger to step back. Van lowered his head and fell silent. The commander ended the discussion and declared that the forceful reconnaissance would now begin. She announced that she would personally lead the company from the front, then ordered every unit to prepare for immediate deployment. Around the table, the soldiers answered in one voice that they understood. After silencing him, Amelia turned to Van Kruger and said that, if he wanted such a cautious battle, his unit would take the rear. She added that it was the safest place. Van clicked his tongue inwardly and thought that this was bad. He reminded himself that even for academy students, disobedience could be punished severely, with expulsion at best and imprisonment at worst. Around him, others quietly thought that Agalda could certainly shine in scouting missions and that they understood Van's argument, but he had spoken far too boldly. They thought that, stuck at the rear and returning empty-handed, he would earn no merit at all. Van lowered his gaze and forced himself to think. He told himself that there had to be something he could do. Then he realized that the rear might allow something only possible because he was stationed there. Soon after, the unit entered the wetlands. Amelia rode at the front with her spear lowered as the cavalry cut through the grass. A moment later, a pack of monsters burst out ahead. Van recognized them as Noxfangs, small swamp-dwelling monsters with low combat power but magical poison in their fangs. One soldier shouted that a small monster squad was ahead and asked whether they should retreat. The commander refused at once. She said that they would sweep aside such weak creatures. A magic circle blazed behind her as she activated her mounted battle magic and cried out the name of Storm Spear Charge. Her spear and spell crashed into the Noxfangs in one violent sweep, tearing through the pack. The soldiers stared in amazement, and one exclaimed that this was Rodenwald's mounted battle magic. Others followed her lead, invoking Flame Arrow and shouting for everyone to follow Lady Amelia. Fire arrows rained down and finished the scattered beasts. The soldiers cheered that the academy students were incredible and that this would be easy. Far to the rear, Van watched the distant blasts and said that it had started. One of his men asked whether they should not chase after them, saying they could do nothing from here. Van told him not to worry about that. Instead, he pointed at a strange plant nearby and ordered the men to pull it out. The soldiers blinked in confusion. One muttered in disbelief, and another said that the plant would not even work as firewood. Van answered that he knew and would explain later. For now, he ordered them to quietly gather as much of it as possible. Though baffled, the men accepted the order. At the front, Amelia cut down another beast and ordered the unit to resume the advance. She shouted for them to keep moving. As the cavalry pressed forward, a soldier suddenly pointed ahead and said that there was something over there. Amelia turned toward it. Another man praised the sharp-eyed soldier for spotting it and eagerly asked whether they should hunt it. Someone else said that this time he would take the first strike. The group charged toward the strange purple figure rising in the distance. Then everything changed. A burst of violet lightning erupted from the haze. The soldiers recoiled as a body dropped to the ground. One of them stared blankly and asked what had just happened. Amelia snapped her gaze upward. From the storm of purple energy, a giant insect-like monster descended before them, crackling with